The Dresden clock on the mantel struck 12 in soft, slow, golden notes. As the gentle echoes died away, Horace Abernethy, sitting huddled in a Morris chair before the fire of logs, stirred feebly. Presently, he sat erect, moving clumsily, with the laboriousness of senility. But there was nothing of the aged in the glances of his keen, dark eyes, which shone forth brightly from out the pallid parchment of his face. His intent gaze darted first toward the clock, to verify the hour of which the gong had given warning. It went next to the closed window on the right of the fireplace, over which the shades had not been drawn. The unsheltered panes were spangled with raindrops, and, as he watched, a new gust beat its tattoo on the glass. The old man drew down the tip of his thin, beak-like nose in a curious movement of disgust, then stroked petulantly the white cascade of beard that flowed to his bosom. "Curse such weather!" he snarled, in a voice querulous and shrill with years. He stood up with sudden alertness, surprising after his first awkward slowness. A brisk gesture of the head threw back from his face the luxuriant white curls of hair. "But, in spite of it, I must go again, and so make an end of the job. Else, death might take me unawares." Abernethy glanced aimlessly about the long, low-ceiled room, now lighted only by the glow from the fire. After a little, he advanced to the center, where a concert grand piano dominated the scene. In a moment more, he had lighted the tall lamp that stood at hand. A sheet of music in manuscript was lying on the rack. He seized this, and scanned it eagerly, muttering the while. "Curious it should work out so," he exclaimed, at last. "Curious, and infernally clever, too." He seated himself before the instrument, still holding communion with his thoughts. "Yes, it will do. Capitally, and it has the spirit of the thing. It chants the curse." Suddenly, as he ceased speaking, the old man lifted his arms in a quick, graceful movement. The long, claw-like fingers, supple still, fell vehemently on the keys, in a clamor of melancholy music. There was only a single strain of melody, that written on the page before him, but he played it again and again, as if obsessed by its weird rhythm, played it blatantly, tenderly, with reluctant slowness, with masterful swiftness. And, as he went on, he abandoned the simplicity of the written score. In its stead, he multiplied harmonies, superimposed innumerable variations. The musical rapture revealed the decrepit old man as a virtuoso. The treatment of the themes showed him to be at once the scholar and the creature of vivid emotional imagination, while the physical interpretation of the dreaming that drove him on displayed a technique astonishing in one so burdened with years. But ever, throughout the wildest extravagances of his fancy's flight, there was no failure of that first morbid rhythm, of that first monotonous melody in minor set on the sheet before him. This was the score on which he built the ordered sequence of his improvisations. The player ended with a harsh clangor from the keys, and whirled about on the stool to stare intently toward the wall opposite the fireplace. Now, his pallid face in the glimpse that showed above the beard, was faintly flushed from the bodily strain of playing. But the fire burning in the dark eyes proved that the emotion within still maintained its vigor undiminished. Springing up, he drew his tall, thin form to its full height, and stood thus motionless for a long minute, gazing fixedly at the wall before him. Then, again with the swift movement of the head by which the white mouth of one of the bags. It was only a matter of seconds until the sack gaped open. He paused now, to stare about the room with furtive, fearful eyes. His scrutiny was directed principally toward the windows. His lips were drawn in a snarl as he realized that the shades had not been pulled down. He sprang to his feet, and darted to the nearest, where he arranged the shade to his satisfaction, mumbling and mouthing the while. Afterward, he made a round of the room, very swiftly, yet using all care to render himself secure from observation by anyone without. A glance at the doors having shown him that all these were shut fast, he at last strode back to the table, where the money bags awaited him. The chair was drawn close. Into it, Abernethy sagged heavily, as if in sudden relaxation from the taut energy that had urged him on hitherto. For a half-minute, he sat crouched over the table in an attitude of utter weariness, almost of collapse. But abruptly, he aroused himself from the clutch of lethargy. Once again, he held himself upright. Again, his eyes searched the room craftily, alight with emotional fires. Finally, his arms rose swiftly, swooped forward and downward, until the talon-like fingers closed on the bags, which he drew tight to his breast where it pressed against the table. In this posture, which was like an embrace, he remained moment after moment, tense, alert, movelessly alive in every fiber of him. Then, putting term to the rapturous pause, the old man sighed faintly, as one who, with infinite reluctance, awakes from ecstasy. He sat rigid, and pushed the two bags a slight distance from the edge of the table. For another little interval, he stared at them, half doubtfully, in the manner of one returning slowly to reality after the illusions of a dream. A second sigh was breathed from his lips, not blissful now, but weighted with bleak despair. Presently, he tossed his head impatiently, and began fumbling with the string of the second bag. This yielded speedily, as had that of the first. In another instant, he had poured forth the contents of the two sacks. On the table before him lay twin heaps of gold. Afterward, for more than an hour, the miser gave full play to his vice. Before the smoldering fires of the metal, he worshipped devoutly, abjectly. His soul prostrated itself in adoration beneath the golden glory that he so loved and reverenced. At times, he plunged his fingers within the heaps, listening raptly to the clinking song of the coins as they were moved haphazard by the contact. At times, he sat dumb, crooning softly, as if these bits of metal had been sentient things to hark to his hymn of praise. Other vagaries were his, innumerable follies, nameless abasements before this, his most sacred shrine. Of a sudden, Abernethy sprang to his feet. Leaving the glittering piles on the table, he hurried to the piano, where he seated himself with face turned toward the altar of his worship. The supple fingers touched the keys anew. The melancholy air which he had played before sounded once again. But now, it was rendered simply, without extremes of emotion on the part of its interpreter, without variations in its harmonic forms. Instead, the old man played it slowly and gently throughout, repeating it monotonously many times. The morbid rhythm stood forth ghastly in its naked, sordid truth. It came as a hopeless confession of despair, the ultimate fact in the vice that was his master. Abernethy went back to the table, stacked coins until he had the measure of a bag full, and thus divided the gold, which was then returned to the sacks. Next, he brought forth other bags from the vault, until the table was covered. This done, he went out of the room, to reappear after a minute, wearing an old soft hat and a raincoat with capacious pockets, in which he stored, one by one, the bags of gold. 2 more trips will do it, he muttered to himself, shaggily with thick, iron-gray hair. The face showed rugged ugliness, emphasized by muddy skin. His voice was wheezy from climbing the stairs. Well, and what's it all about? What and why? Filibustering. Abduction. Sunken treasure. Count me in on the scheming, strategy, conspiring, plotting. But leave me out when it comes to donning the diving suit, or engaging in the merry sword play at the head of the stairs, or any aviation. Well, it is like old times to be together. He had shaken hands with the 2 men while speaking, serenely disregarding their verbal greetings, for his huge voice boomed over theirs. No cigarette, he concluded, waving away the offered box, as he sank down beside Morton on the couch. I prefer a man's smoke. He drew forth, prepared and lighted an especially fat and black cigar. The doctor says I smoke too much, he added, comfortably, after inhaling a startling volume of the smoke. Sachs smiled unsympathetically. It's eating so much and taking no exercise that makes you puffy. Billy Walker snorted indignantly. I only eat enough to keep this absurdly large carcass of mine properly stoked, he declared. Of course, I don't take violent exercise. I want my strength for brain work. You can't use the same vital force in two ways. If I wanted to be intellectually foolish like you and Roy, why, I'd consume my energy in keeping hard as nails. I, however, prefer intelligence to biceps. Where's Dave? That's the answer, Sachs exclaimed, as a knock again sounded. A moment later, David Thwing, the third and last guest, was in the room. He was the only short member of the group, but he was broad across the shoulders, with a stocky form that promised unusual strength. He might have been good-looking, but for the fact that his nose had once been disastrously smashed and never rightly repaired. Its present outline was as choppy as the Channel seas in a gale. It gave to his face a suggestion of the prize ring. Now that the party was complete, Sachs bade his guests take their places at the table. No explanations till we're done with the meal, he announced, in answer to the questions of his friends. It was only when the table had been cleared of all save decanters and glasses and smoking materials, that he at last stood up to address his friends. A certain formality in his manner arrested their attention, and they regarded him with a sudden increase of curiosity. It's now 6 years since we left the university, Sachs began. In the last year, we made a boyish pact. We agreed to answer the call of any one of us who became embarked in adventure of a sort to require the assistance from the others. So I have summoned you in accordance with the terms of our agreement. You see, I really have a sort of adventure to offer you, though perhaps you'll think I'm a bit selfish in the matter, for the profit will be all mine. Roy, however, has made money enough so that he doesn't need any more, and Billy always did have more than he could spend, with his foolish ideas of just learning things, instead of living them. Dave is reasonably poor, but, too, he's reasonably honest, and so he's better off without the temptations of great wealth. I've come to the conclusion, after careful reflection, that I'm the only one of the quartet who actually is in want of money. My tastes are luxurious, and, too, I have ambitious projects in the direction of operas that I wish to write. I can't give myself to such serious work while I have to turn all my energies into musical potboilers to soothe the savage breast of the wolf at the door. The metaphor is mixed, Billy Walker grumbled. The purpose of potboilers is to soothe the stomach, not the breast. But what could be expected of a composer essaying oratory? Sachs accepted the criticism without rancor. Anyhow, I'll let that stand by way of introduction, he continued. The pith of character limit is exceeded. Pains of giving me any credit, if your honesty be over nice, or worrying your conscience if you chance to be dishonest. I have no idea that I shall be messing around anywhere in your environment after I am once dead, and the world's praise can be less than nothing to me after I have gone from earth. But because you are a musician and, as I have come to believe, an earnest one, I have decided to make you heir to my musical legacies certainly, to my money perhaps. I'll explain the perhaps presently. But first I must tell you of the love that rivaled my love for music. This was for your mother. On that account my thoughts have been directed to you with special force. On that account this letter to you and all this letter implies. Your mother is a girl possessed a wonderful natural voice and, too, the soul of a musician. It so chanced that she and I were neighbors and we met often socially. I was only a few years older than she, and I was already skilled in music, for I had devoted myself to the study of it from childhood. I recognized the supreme worth of her voice at the first hearing. I fell in love with your mother then, as a man with a woman, yes, even more as a musician in love, with a glorious instrument of music. It soon became evident that while she liked me, she could not love me as a wife should love her husband. I realized the truth, and though I suffered as an emotional temperament must suffer in such case, I did not despair. The musician in me triumphed over the man, for I rejoiced in the glorious gift that she would manifest to the world. So I merged my passion for the woman in the enthusiasm of the maestro for his pupil. I offered myself as her teacher and she accepted me in that capacity. For 2 years I taught her. Under my training, her method became perfect. Her soul, too, grew, so that she had sympathy and understanding. Then, just when she was all prepared for her triumph and my own, she fell in love with your father. She married him. In spite of all my prayers, my reproaches, my supplications, she abandoned her career for love's sake. Her husband was opposed to his wife's appearing in public as a singer. She yielded to his wishes without remonstrance. I believe she was happy in her way because she loved your father sincerely, and she counted no sacrifice too great for love. You, as a musician, can apprehend perhaps the suffering I underwent in consequence of this disappointment. It sickened me of my fellows, made me a recluse. It was in my life of retirement that I developed my third love, that of the miser for gold. I secretly transformed all my possessions into gold, which I kept in a secret safe here in my house. Oh, the hours of night during which I have worshipped before the shining heaps. But enough has been written at one time and another over the raptures of the miser, a rapture without justification in reason, yet more masterful than any other. I shall not weary you with explanation or excuse. The statement of the fact alone is sufficient. Now at last I find myself the victim of a disease that must end my life course within a few days, perhaps hours. It becomes necessary then for me to dispose of my wealth. I am without relations with the exception of a distant cousin and her daughter, who are already well-to-do. To this daughter I have left my house here and the land that goes with it, 1,000 acres, which has some value today and will have more very soon, as the region is being opened up. For the bulk of my wealth, which as I have said is in gold, I have selected you as a possible heir, but you must do your part. I have thus chosen. Chapter 2. The Secretary. In the performance of her secretarial duties, May Thurston duly drummed on her machine the remarkable letter to Saxe Temple, in which the old miser made known his intended disposition of a golden treasury. Because she possessed an excellent New England conscience, the girl maintained silence, despite the urgings of a feminine desire to share the secret. This reticence on her part was the more admirable inasmuch as, just at this time, her affections were becoming strongly engaged by a suitor. Hartley Masters, the man in the case, was a civil engineer employed in the neighborhood with a survey for an electric road. On one occasion, he had stopped at Abernethy's cottage for a glass of water from the well. The master of the house was absent at the time, but the secretary was present, and, by some chance, out of doors that pleasant May morning. Conventions seemed rather absurd in that remote region. The young engineer admired the charming face and slender form, and hastened to engage her in conversation. She responded without reluctance, rather with pleasure in this diversion from the monotony of her days. Afterward, a considerable intimacy developed between the two. May Thurston had much of her time free, and Masters contrived so to arrange his work as to take full advantage of her leisure. That his heart was touched seriously may be doubted, but his courtship lacked nothing in the evidences of intensity and sincerity. He made a deep impression on the girl, who was both ingenuous and tender. Masters was the first to whom she had given more than the most casual heed, and, almost at the outset, she found her affections engaged. She regarded him as astonishingly handsome, as, in truth, he was, in a melodramatic fashion of his own, with huge dark eyes, long-lashed and glowing, a sweep of black mustache, and thick, clustering hair, which was always artistically tousled. In fact, the whole appearance of the man was blatantly artistic, in the bohemian acceptation of the word, and he was scrupulous to wear on all occasions a loose bow of silk at his throat. He was tall, too, and broad enough, but there was too much slope to his shoulders, his neck was too long, his head bulked too large for harmony. His voice was agreeable, his manners were suave, quickened by a jauntiness, which was perhaps assumed to harmonize with the insouciant air of the cravat. May Thurston, who had read her Byron, thought of him as the Corsair, and her heart fluttered. It is easily understood that the secretary's keeping silence concerning her employer's remarkable testamentary plans showed her the possessor of some strength of character, as well as a sense of honor. She even managed to keep her own counsel after Masters openly declared his love, and besought her to become his wife, at some vague time in the future, when he should have arrived at a position of independence. She yielded readily to his ardor, and had plighted troth, all eight tremble with maidenly confusion and womanly raptures. Then, a few days later, Abernethy died. She felt now that she was at liberty to reveal the circumstances of the will to her lover. As they strolled on the lake shore, the evening of the day after the miser's death, May told the story, to which Masters listened with absorbed attention. "Mad as a hatter," he ejaculated, contemptuously, as the girl brought her narrative to a close. Yet, though his voice was mocking, there was manifest in his expression an eagerness that puzzled the girl. She would not permit his comment to go unrebuked. "No," she declared firmly, "Mr. Abernethy was not mad. He was eccentric, of course. Very. That was all, however. He wasn't crazy. Unless every miser is crazy. He had a sense of humor, though, and he didn't quite know what to do with his money." "What do you mean by that, Hartley?" she demanded. "I mean," came the deliberate answer, "that this hidden fortune of Abernethy's doesn't really belong to anyone at this moment." "Nonsense!" the secretary exclaimed briskly, confident as to the fact out of her stores of business experience. "The money belongs to the estate. By due course of law, it will go to Saxe Temple, if he fulfills the condition under which it has been left him. If he fails, it will go to the girl and the musicians' home." She smiled contentedly, pleasantly conscious of her own erudition, and looked out over the lake again, watching idly the frolicking dance of the swallows to the movement of the waves. On the contrary, Masters continued argumentatively, "At this very moment, the ownership of that gold is problematical. Nobody exactly owns it, although theoretically the title to it is vested in the surrogate's court, or whatever they call it in this wilderness. As a matter of strict fact, that gold has become hidden treasure. To be sure, the old man has left directions as to who shall have it if found, and who shall have it if it is not found. But, suppose now, someone else were to find it, not Saxe Temple." The girl uttered an ejaculation, and faced her lover with startled surprise, meeting the fire of his gaze bewilderedly. "Suppose I were to find it?" May Thurston sprang to her feet, and regarded the speaker with an expression of sheer amazement, which swiftly changed to one of dismay. The softly tinted rose of her cheeks flamed suddenly to scarlet. Her luminous eyes, usually so gentle, sparkled dangerously. She stared fixedly at the man for a few seconds. At first, he encountered her gaze steadily enough, smiling. But, presently, under the accusation in her look, the smile passed from his lips, and his eyes fell. The girl continued to observe him indignantly for a few moments more. Then, at last, she spoke, and now there was more of sorrow than of anger in her voice. "Hartley." The exclamation was a reproach, and as such the young man recognized it. He rose quickly, caught May's hands in his, and spoke tenderly in justification of himself, his eyes again meeting hers boldly. In the days that followed, Masters showed a wily patience. He recurred to the subject of the miser's gold again and yet again. The girl's reluctance slowly grew less, as she found herself unable to combat the ingenuities of his reasoning. Finally, she reached a point where she no longer opposed his wishes, although she still held to her own conviction as to the wrongfulness of that which he proposed. The man felt that he could trust to her neutrality, so reluctantly conceded. With this for the time being, he rested content. Chapter 3 The Assembling. The dwelling in the wilderness contained only 2 servants, a woman of 50, who performed the duties of housekeeper and cook, and her husband, slightly older, who did the small amount of outdoor work required about the cottage, but, during the open weather, was chiefly concerned with the care of the 2 motor boats, which had been the miser's single extravagance. After the funeral, the lawyer of the deceased ordered Jake Dustin and his wife to remain at the cottage for the time being, to await the outcome of the bequest. May Thurston, also, was retained as the one person most conversant with Abernethy's affairs. Suddenly come to dominate his thoughts, and it allowed no rivalry. He was pale, as if after a sleepless night, and his thatch of hair was tangled in a confusion real for once, not contrived with studied pains. His great, black eyes were glowing, as he encountered May at the cottage door. The girl sighed as she noted the haggard appearance of his face and the tenseness of his movements, usually so briskly graceful. A certain latent fierceness in his expression caused a thrill of apprehension in her heart. She was shocked that he could enter thus wholesoledly into a nefarious project for the sake of gain. "Where's the old woman?" Masters questioned curtly, after a scant phrase of greeting. "In the kitchen," May answered. "I must hurry," the engineer continued, alertly. "But, anyhow, I have almost 4 hours clear. They can't get here before 11, I guess. If the train's on time, they should get here about 10:30, May corrected. There was a note of warning in her voice. "Don't let them find you." She broke off, ashamed to finish her thought aloud. Masters laughed shortly. "No fear. I'll watch out. But hold them back as much as you can," he bade her. Without more ado, he entered the house. She heard him go quickly into the music room, shutting the door behind him. For a moment, she rested motionless, irresolute, her face troubled. Then, with a gesture of annoyance, she turned away, and went toward the waiting launch. The northbound train arrived hardly a minute behind its schedule. May, waiting eagerly on the station platform, scrutinized the few passengers as they clambered down from the day coaches. Then, her attention was caught by the activities of a colored porter at the vestibule steps of the Pullman. Beside him, on the cinder path, were 3 valises of heavy leather, somewhat battered, but of undeniable dignity. As the man adjusted the portable step beside the track, 2 women appeared above him on the platform of the car. May had no doubt as to their identity. She noted the simple elegance of Mrs. West's traveling suit, the modish air of the daughters. She observed, too, the radiant loveliness of the girl's face. A subtle premonition of sorrow obsessed her, as she stared half resentfully at the beauty of Margaret West, elusively revealed from within a mesh of gray veil. She fought against the mood, and went forward to greet the strangers. The manner of the 2 travelers was so cordial that the secretary quickly forgot her presentiment. Mrs. West proved to be a handsome, though rather delicate, woman, of perhaps 50 years. In voice and manner, and in nature as well, a true gentlewoman of a type now somewhat out of fashion. As May had already learned from her late employer, this lady had, throughout her life, enjoyed ample means, though not great wealth. The daughter, Margaret, resembled the mother. But in her slender form was the grace of youth. "There's no doubt that it is still a real wilderness hereabouts," Margaret declared, after the first greetings had been exchanged. "I thought it might have changed, since our visit 10 years ago. And it is still all wilderness for the way we have yet to go in the motor boat," May answered, smiling. "Here is Jake. Mr. Dustin, you know. He'll carry your valises to the landing." She indicated the embarrassed boatman, who was hovering doubtfully near. With attention thus thrust upon him, he grinned sheepishly, then turned to the luggage. "Chris will help him," Mrs. West said. May looked in the direction of the speaker's nod, and started in astonishment. In her absorption with the 2 women, she had observed neither the coming nor the presence of this man. Now, she regarded him curiously. Evidently, from his appearance, as well as from Mrs. West's words, he was a servant, and made nothing. "I found nothing at all," he declared, curtly. His large eyes were glowing with anger. "I can't understand it." His tone was full of rebellion against the injustice of fate. But, May began. Her voice was hesitating, timid. Masters went on stormily, disregarding her. I mustn't give up though. Just because they've come. He nodded toward the cottage. You must introduce me, at once. Then, get them outside, to look about, and I'll have another try at the gold. The girl was dismayed by his persistence. She wished to point out the danger of discovery, but the engineer would listen to no protests, and, in the end, his inflexible will beat down her resistance. So, presently, Masters was duly introduced to Mrs. West and her daughter. His manner was now all suavity. He devoted himself to making a good impression, and in this he succeeded, for he was in fact usually attractive to women, though not to men, who regarded him with latent suspicion, or open hostility, according to their various natures. In this instance, his handsome face, graceful, frank manner and lively chat diverted and pleased the mother, while the more susceptible daughter found herself near to blushing under the earnest regard of a stranger so romantic of appearance and so respectfully, yet obviously, an admirer of her own charms. Indeed, though Masters was very discreet, his manner somehow caused the trouble in May's heart to swell, for now it was leavened with jealousy. Yet, there was nothing overt, to which she might take exception. It was, rather, an intuition that warned her. But, when she again found herself alone with her lover, she was confronted with offense in his first words. We must keep our engagement secret from them. Though May had had no thought of any present publicity for her romance, this peremptory command came with a shock. Why? She demanded. What do you mean, Hartley? Masters became fluently plausible. His seeming candor disarmed criticism. Margaret West is a pretty girl, he explained, smiling, at last, and she is evidently aware of the fact. If she thinks I'm dangling, so to speak, a victim to her charms, she and her mother won't wonder any at my hanging around the place a good deal. And it is Miss West's place now, you know. It wouldn't do for me to make myself too much at home here just as your fiancé, she might be jealous. His smile over this none too delicate pleasantry was so caressing, his voice was so tender, he was so tall, so stalwart in picturesque fashion, so good to look on altogether, that May quite forgot her first instinct of indignation. After all, doubtless, he was right. But you won't let her think you really serious, she stipulated. Masters' face instantly grew grave. His voice took on a dignity almost rebuking. No, little girl, he said, gently, that wouldn't be fair to you, or to her, or to me. But we'll keep our secret for a time. And to this, albeit reluctantly, May consented. That reluctance must have become open revolt, could she have known the inner workings of her lover's crafty and unscrupulous brain. For the fact of the matter was that the engineer had no sooner set eyes on Margaret West than new, daring plots began to shape themselves in his imagination. His heart thrilled at sight of her. His interest deepened second by second. He experienced, indeed, an attraction strange, dominant. The emotion was the more impressive inasmuch as it was totally unlike that with which May Thurston had inspired him. He had admired the secretary in rather a placid fashion. He had enjoyed her dainty appearance, he had been agreeably entertained by her lively intelligence. Most of all, he had received flattering unction to his vanity from the ease of his triumph over her heart. The case of Margaret was radically different. Even in the first interview with this girl, he found himself subject to a spell hitherto character limit as exceeded. Mr. Temple and party, I calculate, he remarked inquiringly, looking from one to another. I am Mr. Temple, said the heir, with an answering smile, as he stepped forward. He indicated his companions with a gesture. These are my friends, come to help me on a bit of business I have in the neighborhood. You know about it. Jake beamed joyously. Well, now, I've got quite some suspicionings, as it were, he admitted, cautiously. I hope you've left everybody well to hum. Oh, I believe some in the city are complaining, Sachs replied, with apparent seriousness, but the general health is about the average. Just so. Jake showed himself gratified. Well, I'll lead ye over to the motorboat. Billy Walker groaned stertorously. And we're not there even yet, he exclaimed, aghast. Oh, putty nigh, Jake made assurance. Only a matter o' 3 mile on the lake. We'll get thar in a jiffy, in the shirts o'. The what? Sachs questioned. That's the ornery name old man Abernethy give a perfectly good boat, Jake replied, complainingly. He said as how it meant kind o' lively. The name must Bescherzo, Sachs explained to the unmusical and bewildered Billy Walker. The motor boat, you know. But Billy was not appeased. He kept at Jake's side, as the party moved toward the landing, a furlong to the east from the station, and expressed his sentiments vehemently, though not lucidly, so far as the boatman was concerned. I'm given to understand, he said severely to the puzzled Jake, that your craft is not merely a plain, slow-going, safe and sane fourth launch, but, on the contrary, one of those cantankerous, speed-maniacal contraptions that scoots in diabolical and parabolical curves, and squirts water all over the passengers. If so, I think I'll walk, though I'm not fond of walking. Jake seized eagerly on the one intelligible phrase in Billy Walker's bombast. Nary squirt, he declared, with emphasis. Old man Abernethy, he was lean, just like you be, and I learned to nuss the shirts careful. Mighty careful, yes, siree. The others, who had overheard, laughed impudently at this naive reference to the invalidism of their friend, whose physical inertia was equal to his mental energy. At sight of the motor boat, Roy Morton gave critical attention, scanning it with the supercilious manner of one versed in the mysteries, as, indeed, he was. Unbidden, he ensconced himself at the engines, in the seat with Jake. Soon, however, his coldly inquiring expression softened to radiant satisfaction, as he noted the smoothness of the start, the delicate adjustment from speed to speed, the rhythm of the perfectly tuned cylinders. Of a sudden, as he turned to stare at the wizened face of the old man at his side, Roy's eyes grew gently luminous, a smile that was tender curved the lips above the belligerent chin. He knew that Jake loved his engines, knew perfectly that the old man fairly doted on them, cherished them even as a lover his mistress. Because of the sympathy that he, too, had with such things, Roy respected the boatman mightily, began then and there to grow fond of the brown and shriveled face. Billy Walker, for his part, after the first few moments of suspense, became convinced that his anticipations of disaster were little likely to be realized in fact, and thereafter he gave himself over to delighted contemplation of the wooded shores, which on either side sloped gracefully to the water's edge. David Thwing, too, gazed about on the newly budded beauty of the wilderness with a content made keen by overlong sojourning in the places builded by men. It was only Sachs Temple himself, alone in the stern chair, who looked around with eyes that just then recked not of the scenic loveliness, despite the appeal in such vistas to one of his beauty-loving temperament. But his whole interest, now, was centered on the quest that had character limit as exceeded. She would have delighted to tell this new friend of the engagement that existed between herself and the engineer, but she had passed her word not to do so, and it never occurred to her as possible that she should break it. At times, Masters joined the girls in their rambles, but that avaricious gentleman, though eager to press his suit with Margaret, could not often bear to absent himself from the scene of operations that had to do with the treasure. So, for the most part, he either joined the group on the porch, or gave himself over to loitering hidden in the woods, at a point a few hundred yards to the south, where a thick screen of undergrowth effectually offered a barrier against observation from the cottage. By such espionage, he was sure to be instantly advised concerning any discovery of a clue, as it would create excitement among those on the piazza. He would have preferred to remain constantly among the searchers, but this was patently impossible. Masters was by no means lacking in shrewdness, however great his shortcomings in the way of respect for meum et tuum, and he was both sensitive and sensible enough to know that his company was not especially agreeable to Temple and his friends in their exploration of the house. It was, in truth, rather curious to note the various opinions held in reference to the engineer by the four men engaged in seeking Abernethy's treasure. Masters had been introduced to them by May on the morning after their arrival at the cottage, and had shown himself as friendly as possible. But, in accordance with the usual effect he had on men, the impression created by him on each of the four was distinctly unpleasant. Saxe Temple felt an intuitive dislike, which he was at no pains to explain. Billy Walker regarded the engineer with a mingling of amusement and disdain, ill-concealed, and he did not scruple afterward to describe the visitor as a peculiarly obnoxious romantic pirate, with a flamboyant veneer of the courtier Latin. But he refused to take the fellow with much seriousness. In this respect, he differed from Roy Morton, who made it a rule to be uniformly suspicious of all things and all persons, and lived up to this rule with finical fidelity. He immediately characterized the engineer as a completely base and designing person, one of whom all decent and honest men might well beware. He proved his contentions quite to his own satisfaction by physiognomy, by phrenology, by chiromancy, by the sixth sense and by the fourth dimension. David Thwing, who was ordinarily a kindly soul, made some small effort to combat the severity of Roy's strictures, but the philanthropic attempt failed dismally of appreciation, which result troubled David not at all, since his heart was not in the task. Ensued a week of feverish activity on the part of Saxe and his friends, in which Billy Walker was as busy as any, although his toil was exclusively mental, while his body remained in its customary lethargic condition. By day and by night, he devoted himself to examination of the problem that confronted his friend, and by day and by night the other three carried out his every suggestion. Unfortunately, however, for Saxe's hopes of inheritance, their first hurried search of the cottage resulted in naught save weariness and dismay. Of anything in the nature of a clue, they found no least trace. Billy Walker delivered the final decree in a council held by the four, after dinner on the seventh day. It had so chanced that the friends were alone together in the chief room of the cottage, which was the music room. "I've addled my wits in vain," Billy Walker confessed, dolefully. "Until there shall have been an accumulation of new intellectual energy on my part, I shall be able to offer you no theory as to the actual hiding place so ingeniously selected by the late lamented Mr. Abernethy, to whose ashes, peace. While I am thus recuperating, however, character limit is exceeded." Finally, the musician's attention, during a pause, was attracted to a stack of music, which was lying on top of a cabinet, at the right of the piano. He rose, and, going to it, began glancing over the sheets. His eyes lighted with admiration as he noted the various compositions in the collection. In this examination of the music, he realized, as he had not done hitherto, the virtuosity of that dead miser who had made him the possible heir to wealth. For here was not save the most worthy in the world of musical art. There was not a single number of the many assembled that was not a masterpiece of its kind. In its entirety, the series presented the very highest forms of musical expression, the supreme achievement, both intellectual and emotional, in the art. For the first time, Saxe felt a gust of tenderness toward the lonely old man, for the sake of their brotherhood in a great love. And, then, at the very bottom of the heap, Saxe came on a single sheet, which drew his particular attention. The page showed a few measures written in manuscript. This fact alone was sufficient to make the sheet distinctive in the collection, inasmuch as it was solitary of its sort. Every other composition was from editions by the best publishers. With his newly aroused interest in Abernethy, it befell that Saxe was pleased thus to come on a composition which, he made sure, must have been from the pen of Abernethy himself. Yet, as he scanned the few bars, the young man experienced a feeling of vivid disappointment, for the work was by no possibility of a kind to compel particular admiration. So, at least, it seemed to him just then. With a sense of disillusionment concerning the quality of the dead miser's genius, Sachs carried the sheet of music to the piano, where he placed it on the rack, then began to play. As the first chord sounded, Mae Thurston, seated in a chair near the door, made a movement of surprise. Afterward, as she rested quietly in her place, there lay on her face a look of melancholy that was very near dejection. The music that Sachs played was this. Listen. Thus, Sachs Temple played the few simple phrases, over which the old miser had lingered so long one desolate night. But, now, a vast difference appeared in the manner with which the music was sped. Abernethy had rendered the composition with astonishing intensity of emotion. He had interpreted the harsh measures with exquisite, though melancholy, tenderness. He had clanged them forth with the spirit of frantic appeal, with hot passion in the uncouth numbers, with crass, savage abandonment. Again, with the superimposing of mighty harmonies, vast, massive, dignified. Now, the genius was gone from the reading. Sachs Temple felt no least degree of sympathy for this crude, unpleasant fragment. On the contrary, the piece affected him only disagreeably. To his musical sense, this creation by the miser was peculiarly offensive. Yet, through some subliminal channel, the stark sequence of the rhythm laid thrall on him, so that he ran over the score not once but many times. Nevertheless, he always set the music forth nakedly, unadorned by any graces of variety in the interpretation, undraped by ingenious harmonies. He played merely the written notes, played them with precision, reluctantly, and, when finally, he had made an end, he still sat on at the piano, staring toward the written page, as one vaguely troubled by a mystery. It was Mae Thurston who broke the little interval of silence that followed after the music ended. "I've heard that before, Mr. Temple," she said. "Many, many times." Sachs whirled on the piano stool to face the girl. "Yes," he said, and there was a note of bewilderment in his voice. "I should imagine so. As it is in manuscript, it was probably composed by Mr. Abernethy himself. But I must say that I'm greatly disappointed in it. I can't discover any particular merit in it. What I don't like about women," exclaimed Roy Morton, with an inflection of disgust, "is the kind of men they like." It was the morning of another day, and the exhaustive search commanded by Billy Walker as the mouthpiece of inexorable logic had begun. The voice of the oracle could at this moment be heard from the porch, where he was engaged in pleasant conversation with Mrs. West, while his three friends were busy with the actual work of investigation. They were in the small room opening off the hall, on the ground floor, which had been used by the late owner of the cottage as a sort of office. There, he had kept all of his business papers, at least as far as the knowledge of his secretary went. A flat-top desk in the center of the room contained a number of drawers, and in one corner stood a small iron safe. Under the terms of the will, every freedom was accorded to the searchers, and now safe and drawers had been opened for their convenience by Mae Thurston, who thus followed the instructions she had received from the lawyer. At the moment when Roy made his rather bitter remark concerning the nature of womankind, he had just observed, through a window that looked out to the south, a trio strolling along the lake shore. The three were Margaret, Mae and the ubiquitous Masters. It was the presence of the engineer that had aroused the indignation of Roy, and had caused him thus cynically to stigmatize feminine indiscretion in friendship. Himself a devotee of the fair sex, though shockingly irresponsible as an eligible bachelor, it irked him mightily that the requirements of his present relation to Sachs were such as to hold him there, poring over a motley of sordid bills, receipts, and other financial memoranda, the while a scoundrelly nincompoop so he secretly termed the engineer strutted abroad with two charming girls. David laughed at the disgust in his friend's voice, for he, too, had observed the passing of the three, and he understood perfectly the jealousy that underlay Roy's displeasure in the situation. He paused in his task of conning the year's milk bills of one Eleazar Sneddy, lighted a cigarette, and inhaled the fumes with a sigh of deep gratification. I wouldn't mind being in his place myself, Roy, he said, placidly. The grumbler scowled at his too penetrant crony. Sachs looked up from a sheet of foolscap, covered in the minute handwriting of the miser with long columns of figures by which were set forth details of the expenditures for a month in the matter of postage. He, too, paused, welcoming any diversion from the uncongenial labor, and lighted a cigarette with manifest relief. Be in whose place, Dave? He questioned, idly. Roy attempted a distraction from the topic. Huh. He sneered. This adventure isn't what it has been cracked up to be. No gore, no gold, no anything, except a parcel of musty papers. I have just finished the thrilling items of tenpenny nails in the matter of shingling the cottage. I suppose that poor old miser had a spasm every time he paid for a pound of them. In fact, I'm sure of it, because I get psychosympathetically those same spasms in going over the charges. Psychosympathetically is good, David generously declared. Then, he turned to Sachs. Roy just saw Masters out for a walk with the girls, and it stirred him to envy, naturally enough. It did me, too, for there are certainly two unusually nice girls. Roy's gloomy face lighted in an instant, marvelously. His eyes grew very blue and soft, his lips curved in the smile that made all women like him. Peaches! He ejaculated, with candid enthusiasm. A charming girl, and doesn't seem a bit the sordid, avaricious type, and yet, well, you never can tell. Women are kittle-cattle, and there's a pot of money concerned. I'm thinking she wouldn't be quite plain human, if she didn't want you to fail. Of course she does. She must. Yes, Roy is right enough, Miss West is your natural enemy. Sachs was silenced, and, in a manner of speaking, convinced as well. He was forced to admit the plausibility of the reasoning of his friends, although his feeling was still bitterly opposed to any admission that their contention was just in this particular instance. It occurred to him that, were the case reversed, he would undoubtedly desire the seeker's discomfiture with all his heart, would, in fine, regard the seeker as his natural enemy, just as Roy had designated Margaret West to be his natural enemy. Nevertheless, something within him forbade that he should esteem this girl as one hostile to himself. The color in Sax's cheeks deepened a little. Of a sudden, it was borne in on his consciousness that there existed a most cogent reason why he could not regard Margaret West as an enemy. It was because he so earnestly desired her as a friend. In that instant of illumination, he realized that never before in his life had he longed for the friendship of woman as now he yearned for that of Margaret West. A strange confusion fell on him. He did not quite understand the emotion that welled in his spirit. It was something new to his experience, something subtle, bafflingly elusive, and very, very sweet. Sachs was recalled to the business of the moment by the pained voice of Roy. Digging the drain cost $6.98. Sounds like a department store, was David's amused comment. I learned that, on the 16th of last January, 9 cents was expended in the purchase of the succulent onion. Roy groaned with dismal heartiness. I embark on an adventure. I crave adventure, I seek it in far places and near, wherefore I come hither with my bold companions, hunting a chest of gold. Forthwith, I become an uncertified private accountant. What hideous degradation. I tell you, Sachs, I'm mighty sick of this job. I'd just as lief be assistant bookkeeper in a tannery. Why tannery? David inquired. He pushed the heap of papers aside, and lighted another cigarette, highly pleased with the diversion. Because a tannery happened to be the most disagreeable place I could think of at the moment, was the simple explanation. Smells, you know. Yes, I know, David admitted. His jagged nose wrinkled violently, as memory smote his olfactory nerves. Sachs seized on a topic that promised some measure of distraction from his crowding thoughts. Myself, I don't think much of this method. He waved a hand contemptuously toward the litter of papers on the desk before them. It seems to me that we're just losing time in wading through all this trash. But what shall we do, instead? This is a part of the exhaustive search. Roy sprang up with an exclamation of impatience. No Christian gentleman, not even a miser, would concoct the diabolical idea of preserving a clue to his gold pots amid trash of this sort. Besides, I have a presentiment. Oh, a presentiment. There was a note of scoffing in Sax's voice. But David, in the years since their graduation, had journeyed with Roy through strange places, and so had come to know the whimsical nature intimately, with a consequent respect for some seemingly fantastic idiosyncrasies. Now, he stared at his friend expectantly, with no hint of derision in the look. Roy smiled quizzically, as he met David's earnestly inquiring gaze. "You're not so skeptical, Dave," he said. David smiled wryly, and shook his head. In his gentle, goggling eyes was reminiscence. "It's borne in on my consciousness," Roy continued, rather pedantically, "that the clue isn't character limit is exceeded. There's somebody listening. Look out of the window, Sax." Roy had been sitting for some time with his back to the one window in the room, while the other two had been facing it. There had come no sound from without. Now, instinctively obedient to the command, Sax darted to the window, which was open, and thrust out his head. Close to the wall of the cottage, within a yard of him, stood Hartley Masters in an attitude of absorbed attention. Without attracting the notice of the eavesdropper, Sax drew back, and turned to his friends. He nodded affirmation of Roy's surmise. In the gaze with which he scrutinized the amateur psychic, there was a curious commingling of bewilderment, respect and chagrin. David threw back his head, and laughed joyously, scorning the listener, and spoke his mind. "When Roy gets a hunch, watch out." Chapter 7 Haphazard Questing. Masters, who was not minded to let the value of a small weekly stipend stand between him and the possession of riches, had now abandoned even the pretense of work. He let it be known, casually, at the cottage that he was temporarily idle, while awaiting orders. As a matter of fact, he was awaiting the dismissal that now could not be long delayed. To May, however, he confessed the truth, that he had chosen to sacrifice a paltry certainty for the sake of possible wealth. She had protested against the recklessness of his conduct, but her pleas had fallen on deaf ears. Masters went his way of crafty greed without a moment's faltering. He had exulted on learning from the conversation overheard among the three friends that the systematized search was to be abandoned in favor of a foolish fancy, as he deemed it. While Sax Temple and his companions loitered in expectation of some psychic guidance, Masters would give himself to the quest with an energy that must win him the victory. It was in a very cheerful frame of mind that he betook himself to the cottage on the following morning. Upon his arrival, however, he was at once confronted with a new phase of the situation, which filled him with rage. The engineer found Mrs. West and Billy Walker chatting cozily on the porch, as usual. Mrs. West beamed kindly in her greeting, for she enjoyed the breezy manner of this handsome young man. Billy merely grunted. To judge from the expression of his face, the utterance were better inarticulate. Masters leaned his long length against a pillar at the head of the flight of steps, and joined genially in the conversation for a few minutes, despite the manifest grumpiness of Billy Walker, who, never a courtier, was at no pains to conceal his distaste for the engineer's society. Mrs. West, however, was amiability itself, and Masters was minded to ignore the superciliousness of the other man's manner, though fully conscious of it. He felt that, under the circumstances, he could ill afford to be too finical over such a trifle, notwithstanding the irritation to his vanity. So he rolled a cigarette from the chip tobacco and wheat straw paper which he affected, and chatted jauntily with Mrs. West. When he deemed that a sufficient interval had elapsed, the engineer prepared the way to continue his delayed search of the cottage. "I'll just take a look inside. Miss Thurston promised me a book." Forthwith, He reprobated himself for having employed this particular ruse, for Mrs. West said. Miss Thurston isn't in the cottage, Mr. Masters. You will find her down at the boat house. Masters thanked her with his most winning smile, and strolled away toward the lake. Mrs. West looked after him with a femininely appreciative smile. What a delightful gentleman Mr. Masters is, she remarked innocently to Billy. By way of answer, there came a rumbling, luckily again quite inarticulate. Forced thus by his own error to postpone the anticipated investigation. Oh, but, Mr. Temple, the time's so short. Less than 3 weeks now, it isn't safe. The two were in this attitude of absorbed intimacy when Masters' glance fell upon them. The evident intensity of their interest in each other capped the climax of his rage. He strode forward, with a sneer arching the heavy mustache. At the sound of his steps, the group looked up, and, in varying fashion, each of the four showed unmistakable signs of dissatisfaction at this interruption of the conversation. Masters so far forgot his manners as to make no response to the rather curt nods with which the two men greeted him. Instead, he halted abruptly, and stared, glowering, at Margaret and Sax. After the first moment of astonishment at the engineer's discourteous manner, Sax's expression of animation died out suddenly, to be replaced by a set severity that augured ill for him who should challenge it. Roy's jaw shot out a little, and the veil dropped over his eyes, which, a moment before, had been mild and deep. Margaret could only regard the malevolent face of Masters with sheer amazement, as his wrathful eyes met hers. It was May who saved the situation. She sprang to her feet with a little cry, which might have been of pleasure or of pain. With the intuition of a loving woman, she seized instantly on the fact that something had thrown her lover from his customary poise. Without a particle of hesitation, she employed the first ruse suggested by her woman's wit. "Oh, you did come, after all, in spite of that horrid tooth." She had no least idea as to the cause that had put the man in this tempestuous temper, but she realized the necessity of restoring him to some measure of self-control ere he should commit himself hopelessly by a violent outbreak. The fiction concerning the tooth rose to her lips without conscious volition on her part. The grimace with which Masters faced her, though merely a physical symbol of fury, might well have had its origin in a spasm of pain. As he met May's dismayed and imploring eyes, sanity rushed back on the engineer. By a stern effort, he fought back the flooding wrath. His face worked a little, then settled into a grim repose. While the others waited in silence for the outcome, he suddenly smiled, crookedly. "I had a frightful twinge while I was coming through the woods, but that didn't matter so much, because I was alone, and could make faces, and say just what I wanted to. But I do think it was unkind of fate to visit the worst twinge of a jumping toothache on me at the very instant when I stepped into the presence of company. Forgive me the face I made, please." His big eyes were shining gently now, where before they had been blazing. His demeanor was convincing to the unsuspicious Margaret, who, having once experienced a jumping toothache, was prepared to accept it as full justification for any desperate deed. Of the others, May felt a profound relief in finding that he had so swiftly made use of her offered help, and, for the moment, this satisfaction contented her. Roy adjusted his jaw in a less belligerent fashion, as contempt took the place of anger. Sax found himself smiling, genuinely amused over the fancy of so piratical seeming a person in the throes of toothache. Neither of the men, however, had the slightest doubt that May had offered an ingenious excuse to account for the engineer's savage manner. And forthwith, Sax and Roy began to wonder mightily as to what, in fact, had occurred to destroy so completely the ordinary suavity of this young gentleman whom they cordially detested. Mrs. West sent her servant, Chris, in quest of Margaret, and, soon afterward, May and Masters also went to the cottage, without troubling much for an excuse. So that the two friends were left alone together on the dock. But, before they had time to voice their common astonishment over the scene that had just passed, they were confronted. Character limit is exceeded. Roy nodded assent. "We appreciate the kindness, old chap," he exclaimed. "And let me tell you that I'm going to show my friendship by getting you a decent berth, after this wild adventure is over and done with, where you'll have the chance of your life. Your skill with engines is wasted here. It is, way off in Cuba, but it'll be worth your while. Would you like that?" "You bet ye," was the sententious answer of the boatman, as he turned to lead the way toward the house. Presently, he chuckled yet once again, contentedly, and added, "My old woman Aluz has been a pinin' to travel in furrin parts." Chapter 8. In the recess. At the house, no one was visible with the exception of Billy Walker, who, on the porch, reclined in a large rocking chair, displaying his customary masterly inactivity, the while he contemplated the tip of a particularly black cigar, which he had not troubled to light for the sufficient reason that there were no matches nearer than the hall. The information concerning the recess within the walls was duly imparted to him, and he followed his two friends and the boatman to the closet in the hallway upstairs. The others were inclined to jeer at Billy Walker for this surprising show of activity on his part. But it was a jibe from Roy that put the lethargic one on his mettle. It came after Jake had cut through the paper in a panel from floor to ceiling, by which was revealed a black opening into the space beyond. "And, above all," Roy said, entreatingly, "don't, I beg of you, Billy, let your rash impetuosity lead you to squeezing in here. Remember your paunch, and be warned in time." It is certain that, until this moment, Billy had had no slightest thought of thus venturing into the opening. But human nature is often contrary, and, though ordinarily Billy vastly preferred taunts to physical exertion, in this instance it so chanced that his friend's remark touched him in a sensitive spot. He said nothing at the time, however, contenting himself with a sudden, valiant resolve. So, after candles had been brought, and his two friends had squeezed themselves, one after the other into the opening, Billy Walker, in his turn, essayed an entrance, to the considerable astonishment of Jake, who remained in the hall. "Better take a candle, sir," he suggested, and he offered one already lighted. It was accepted, and, holding it high before him, Billy surveyed the region into which he meant to venture thus intrepidly. By the flickering light, he beheld a very narrow passage, in which, toward the farther end, he could distinguish the deeper shadow that he knew to be Roy, who had been the second to enter. There could be no doubt as to the person's identity, since there was no room in which one person could pass another unless by climbing. At sight of the limited space, Billy was assailed with pangs of regret that he had so vaingloriously undertaken the adventure. Nevertheless, he felt that it was now too late to retreat, and, with a sigh of disgust, he thrust himself forward. He had observed in his brief examination that there was no flooring, but merely the naked joists, over which he must make his way very cautiously, stepping accurately from one to another. Warily, then, he went forward, using every caution. It was by no means pleasant going, because of the precarious footing, and, too, because of the fact that his broad shoulders were unduly constricted by the walls on either side. Disaster came when a nail caught in the sleeve of his coat, just as he gave a lunge forward. The unexpected restraint threw him out of balance. In recovering himself, he dropped the candle. On the instant, his imagination was filled with glaring visions of the house in flames. Alarmed, he stooped his heavy body swiftly. Too swiftly, the three friends went down to the porch, which was still deserted. Billy, who had cast a disgusted glance on the litter in the drawing room in passing, sighed lugubriously, as he sank back into the rocking chair. "No more thrilling adventures by field and flood for me," he boomed. "I have had my bellyful, all at once. Let the cobbler stick to his last, and let me stick to my chair. I got too confoundedly energetic, and I'm old enough to know better. I've messed up the place shockingly, which means so much extra work for the industrious missus. Dustin, whose amiable, but foolish husband got me into this idiotic scrape. You would have found that there was no gold in the place without my assistance. And, unfortunately, I've incurred a financial penalty for my misplaced intrusiveness into the plastering, and when the repairs of Miss West's ceiling shall have been accomplished, it will be my melancholy duty to foot the bill. Oh, misery! The others laughed with the unfortunate, who was now again restored to his usual good humor. But, presently, Sachs spoke in a puzzled voice. You really must have been mistaken, Billy, about having heard someone down below you, in the music room. Billy Walker snorted indignantly. I may possibly be a trifle languorous physically in some ways on occasion, he retorted, but I assure you that my ears are quick enough. I was not mistaken. I heard just what I told you I heard, and I saw, too. The others were unaware that Billy did not exaggerate the excellent quality of his hearing, and, in consequence, they found themselves at a loss. It was Roy, the suspicious, who finally voiced the idea that was bound to find lodgment in their minds. When he spoke, it was in a tone of conviction. The ubiquitous masters, of course. Sachs nodded assent. Spying again, he agreed. We know that he's capable of it. He turned to Billy Walker, inquiringly. The fellow is undoubtedly open to suspicion, after what you caught him at the other day. Billy admitted. Equally of course, we haven't a shred of evidence against him. That doesn't matter a bit, as long as we have the moral certainty, Sachs argued. But the real gist of the problem is, what on earth is the fellow up to, anyhow? It's just pure cussedness, Roy asserted, his face hardening. One look at him is enough to warn anyone that he's spoiling for mischief. He's a rotter, that's all. Billy Walker shook his head, authoritatively. You're wrong, as usual, he announced, with unpleasant frankness. As a matter of fact, our friend, the enemy, has a motive other than sheer deviltry. The others regarded the speaker in surprise, whereat Billy Walker nodded his head vigorously a number of times, and looked very wise indeed. Yes, he continued, with much complacency. After you had told me the incident of his listening to your talk together, I grappled with the problem of the engineer's not minding his own business, and I presently came on the obvious solution of the puzzle. He paused, expectantly. Well, what was it? Roy demanded, impatiently. He was still smarting a little from Billy's sweeping statement as to his own habit of inaccuracy. Sachs, too, showed a keen curiosity in his face. The simple truth of the matter is this, the oracle resumed, when he felt that he had sufficiently whetted their interest by delay. This man, Masters, has a mind to lay hold on Abernethy's treasure himself. He stared triumphantly at first one and then the other of his hearers. The effect on them was enough to satisfy the purveyor of information. Roy fairly gaped in amazement, while Sachs manifested first astonishment, then incredulity, which he voiced baldly. Absurd! He cried. But Billy Walker was prepared to maintain his contention with arguments, and forthwith he did so. And, at the last, Billy made a shrewd suggestion, which, by a totally character limit is exceeded. Chapter X The Gold Song. As Mrs. West, with Margaret and May Thurston, had gone for a stroll soon after the departure of David and the engineer, the mystery concerning the identity of the person in the music room at the time of Billy's misadventure remained unsolved. The subject afforded the friends much opportunity for speculation, all of which resulted in nothing definite. Margaret and her mother showed not the slightest irritation over the way in which the property had been damaged. On the contrary, they were seen to smile whenever their gaze touched the broken place in the ceiling, which remained the mute witness to an inglorious achievement. Sachs, while awaiting the development of another idea for the quest, devoted himself assiduously to Margaret. He made no effort to conceal his infatuation, or, if he did, the attempt was futile. He was, indeed, so flagrant in his court as to fill the engineer with an ever-increasing fury of jealousy, which threatened ill to one or the other of the two young men. On his part, Saxe was made miserable by the affability with which Margaret accepted the attendance of the engineer on her. It seemed monstrous that her instinct should leave her unwarned as to the vicious character of the fellow. Saxe felt that he, as a gentleman, could give her no least word of admonition under the circumstances. He could only do his best to keep at her side every moment, and in this he succeeded remarkably well, though by no means to the extent of his desire. As for the disposition of the girl herself, she showed neutrality between the two men in a manner that, while equally objectionable to each of them, must have commanded the admiration of any unprejudiced observer. Roy devoted himself with good grace to May Thurston, who welcomed him candidly, for her heart was deeply wounded by the patent defection of her lover. Masters had glibly assured her that it was the part of diplomacy just now for him to conceal their real relation by his attentions to Margaret, but his reasoning was not altogether convincing to her intelligence, and the voice of instinct told her that her love was being flouted before her very eyes. In consequence, she greeted this new admirer gladly as a sop to her pride and, presently, as Roy exerted himself to the utmost toward making a favorable impression, for the sake of the genuine pleasure his company gave her. Being a sensible young woman in the main, the inevitable comparisons that soon began to arise in her mind between the two young men did much toward tearing loose the roots of love from her heart, leaving the soil there freshly tilled for the planting of other seed. Mrs. West played her part excellently as chaperone by giving her society much of the time to David and Billy. She was so good to look on in her well-preserved charms, and so wise and sympathetic in her conversation, and so untiring a listener, that the two men found themselves very content. The other three members of the household, Jake, his wife, and Chris made an amiable trio in the kitchen, where Mrs. Dustin, who, as Jake bore witness, had always hankered to go a-travelin', was never weary of hearing the newcomer's tales of strange places whither he had journeyed. For the first time in his life, Chris found himself appreciated at his full worth, perhaps beyond, not as a servant but as a man, by those who, while of a humble walk in life, were yet not of the servant class. He expanded under the novel and pleasing influence, and developed a gift of narrative that surprised himself. He felt a new sense of his own importance, which did not in the least lessen his devotion to Mrs. West and Margaret. On the third night after the episode in the recess, the ladies had retired to their chambers for the night, and the Miser's Song. In it, he translates into musical terms the vice that corroded his soul. In it, he expresses the sordidness of that vice, even as he himself knew it out of dreadful personal experience. And, somehow, he put into the music the strength of the spell that was laid on him. It is there, some malignant fascination which each and every one of us has felt in a fashion of his own. That is why it so gripped Miss Thurston, and why it affected her so disagreeably. It has in it a subtle, irresistible suggestion of the hideous. The ignominy and the power of greed alike sound in the monotony of its rhythm, its harshness, its fearful simplicity. It is uncouth, it is as if it were calloused. Yet, it is full of vital, frightful emotion. It is a statement of ghastly truth, it is a confession of degradation, it is a wail of utter despair. In short, it is the heart song of the miser, written by the brain that looked into the heart and learned its hateful mystery. The others had listened in tense silence, surprised beyond measure before this outbreak from one always hitherto so tranquil, so serene amid the varying stresses of affairs. It was the revelation of their friend in a new light, wherein he showed with an impressiveness strange to them. They watched him intently as he stood there before them, all animation, his handsome face flushed in the passion of the moment. A little sigh of appreciation issued from the lips of each as, with the last words, he sank again to the piano stool, and dropped his hands to the keys. So, once again, he played the music of that dead man who had given himself to a gross and evil worship. Still under the influence of deep emotion, the player now abandoned himself to the theme, and wrought on it with all his skill in music, with all the feeling of repulsion that held him in thrall. There was not in this improvisation the power, the mastery, that had marked the frenzied interpretation by which the composer had amazed the knight. But Saxe Temple was not wanting a large measure of skill, and to this he added the sympathy of the true artist, surcharged with a profound emotion. The uncanny spell of the music laid its hold on them all as he went on playing, gripped them, sent weird visions reeling before their fancy. Even Billy Walker for once was beguiled into a curious receptivity, so that he saw vistas of crouched specters, which ceaselessly shuffled golden coins to and fro, in a frenetic joy that was the madness of anguish. May Thurston, asleep in her chamber, turned uneasily, and her dreams grew troubled. When, at last, Saxe had made an end of playing, there followed a long silence. It was Billy Walker who broke it. His great voice rang through the room, harsh, compelling. "It's there," he said, with simple finality. "It's there. The clue. Chapter X in the wood." The others received the astonishing pronouncement of Billy Walker with varying emotions, of which the chief was a candid incredulity. "How in the world do you justify that remarkable statement?" Roy demanded, breaking the silence of surprise, which had at first held the three. For a moment, Billy showed traces of embarrassment. Then, swiftly, an expression of relief showed on his heavy face, and he spoke glibly enough. "The conclusion to which I have come," he declared ponderously, "is compelled by exact reasoning from all the facts in our possession. The late Mr. Abernethy unquestionably left for his heir some sort of clue as to the hiding place of the money. Having in mind the whimsical nature of the man, we may well believe that, in a case such as this, the clue would be of an especially curious kind. Next, we have the fact that Mr. Abernethy was a musician. He was devoted to that art beyond anything else, excepting only his passion as a miser. Now, our search through his effects and his house has discovered only a single thing having a real, vital character limit is exceeded." With disgust to pursue the argument farther. Saxe did not share in the avowed disbelief of Roy and David. While the others were engaged in disputation, he had gone to the stack of music, and had looked through it until he came upon the sheet of manuscript. Then, he returned to his seat on the stool, placed the music on the rack, and devoted himself to scrutiny of the writing. He felt, somehow, that he dared not reject the suggestion that here was the very thing he sought as the guide to fortune. Nevertheless, though he studied the page with anxious intensity, he could perceive no possibility of any hint to be derived from the simple score of notes. There was nothing set down in the way of diagram, or combination of letters which by twist of ingenuity might be made to suit his need. Nothing showed beyond the phrases of a composition naked in its simplicity. Reason told him that any trust in this manuscript were delusion. Yet, he hung over it, absorbed, even while he chided himself for his interest in a thing plainly worthless to the purpose. It was Billy Walker, turning in disgust from the debate with David, who first observed Saxe's absorption in the manuscript, and his vanity was at once consoled by this mute support. He got up lumberingly, and crossed over to the piano, where he stood looking down at the music. His action caused David and Roy to perceive what Saxe was doing, and forthwith, despite their skepticism, they, too, rose and went to the piano, there to stare down curiously at the manuscript on the rack. Here is a copy of the sheet on which the four adventurers were looking down. Listen. The four stood in silence for a long minute, gazing down at the manuscript page with keen discouragement. Saxe was the first to speak, shaking his head dispiritedly. "It means nothing," he said, with melancholy certainty in his voice. "There is no possibility of its meaning anything. For a moment, I was foolish enough to hope that Billy had really got the right idea, but he hasn't. This is a plain bit of music, nothing more." "Of course," Roy agreed, with a contemptuous inflection. "My personal opinion is that the power of ratiocination is not always what it is cracked up to be, Billy." David, once again, shared the general disbelief. No, he declared, the idea won't hold water. There is no way to convey meaning by the score of a musical composition except the emotion that the author has experienced himself, and wishes thus to interpret to his hearers. The old man meant in this case to tell us of the spell that the love of gold lays on the miser. He has done that. Billy was the one who called our attention to the fact. He must be content with that much glory. His other idea was just poppycock. Billy Walker was unconvinced. I know nothing about music, he conceded. But I have the God-given gift of reason, which is not vouchsafed to the brutes, or to all human beings, I regret to say. Reason convinces me that the clue lies somewhere on this sheet. I reaffirm my conclusion. Since I know nothing of music, the remainder of the work must be done by you. It has now become your responsibility. I have done my part. The dignity and the earnestness with which this declaration was made impressed the doubters in spite of themselves. When Billy had ceased speaking, they remained silent, vaguely hesitant, though quite unconvinced. Sax, perhaps, more than either of the others was desirous, Masters, for it was in truth the engineer, whirled and faced the girl with an expression of terror, which, however, vanished so swiftly that May afterward found herself wondering if in fact she had not merely imagined it. Moreover, he smiled on her with more tenderness than he had exhibited in his manner for days, and his voice, when he spoke, was caressing. "You, May," he cried. His tones indicated a joyous surprise over the unexpected meeting. "You, too, were rivaling the lark this morning, like myself. I woke up 3 hours ago, and, when I found there was no chance to get to sleep again, I decided to commune with nature. I've been trailing a wonderful moth, but I've lost it at last, I'm sorry to say. It was a beauty." He paused from the flow of words, which had been perhaps a trifle too rapid for entire sincerity, and regarded the girl with a glance that was at once fond and quizzical. "And did you, too, have a touch of insomnia?" he inquired. May nodded, rather listlessly. For some reason that she could not understand, she was not convinced by the specious suavity of the engineer's utterance. At the back of her mind was a belief that the man was lying, though she refused to allow the accusation place. Her instinct revolted against the disloyalty of the fellow. Nevertheless, her heart was moved to a last struggle in behalf of the love to which she had once so joyously surrendered herself. She determined on an appeal to that better nature which she believed the engineer to possess. "Hartley," she said softly, "I wish you to do something for me. No, for yourself. I want you to give up this mad idea of securing the gold, Mr. Abernethy hid. The gaze of her dark eyes was full of affectionate pleading. The reply of Masters was prompt, without any least trace of hesitancy. He put out his hand, and took hers, pressing it tenderly. "Dearest," he said softly, "you have been right, and I have been wrong. I see it now. I was carried away for a little while by my longing for money. I wanted it for you, not for myself altogether. You must know that. Now, I have repented. It was my conscience that kept me awake last night. I have already abandoned the idea of trying to get hold of a fortune that doesn't rightly belong to me. Can you forgive me, dearest? I've been a little mad, I think." He paused, and, in the silence that followed, drew her to him, and kissed her very gently on the forehead. May accepted the embrace. Knew not, indeed, how to refuse it, although it failed to thrill her with that rapture which she had once known in his arms. Instead, she sighed in a confusion of emotions, which she herself was far from understanding. As a matter of fact, however, this was the beginning of the end. At last, under the stress of doubt inflicted persistently on her higher nature, the physical attraction exerted by Masters, which, unknown to her, had been the impelling cause for the activity of her imagination in making him an ideal, this potency of sex charm was overwhelmed by the essential antagonism between her soul and his. A certain shyness held her mute, so that Masters was well content with the effect he had secured. But, in this, his self-confidence and the seeming passivity of the girl led him far astray. In truth, May felt assured that Masters lied, and the failure of personal contact to yield any emotion save an actual dissatisfaction set the instinctive disbelief in bold relief. When, soon afterward, they separated, May was secretly aware that her first romance had come to an inglorious end. Chapter 11. The shot. It was in the evening of this same day, at dinner, that the element of tragedy was first injected into the situation. In addition to Mrs. West and her daughter, May Thurston, and the 4 young men, there was present Hartley Masters. He had been invited frequently to dine at the cottage, and had for a time accepted every invitation. Latterly, however, the evidences of strained feeling between him and the other men had become so pronounced that he had usually offered some excuse for declining the kindly hospitality of Mrs. West. Another reason that influenced him in this was his own lack of confidence in his self-control, since the incident at the boat-house, which he had had some difficulty in explaining satisfactorily to May. Nevertheless, tonight, he had chosen to rely on his powers of self-restraint, and had accepted at once when Mrs. West suggested his remaining for the evening meal. The construction of the cottage was such that the dining room was at the back of the house. On the left, as one entered the hall, was the large music room, which occupied the entire ground floor of the added wing. On the right, the first room was that which had served Abernethy as an office. Beyond this came the dining room, with one window at the back, and one on the north side. Mrs. West sat at the head of the table, in such a position that she faced the window to the north. Margaret sat opposite her, while Saxe was placed at her right hand. Beyond him was May Thurston, and beyond her Roy. Billy Walker was beside the hostess on the left, and then David Thwing, while Masters filled the place next to Margaret. The conversation at the table went pleasantly enough, despite the latent hostility between the engineer and the other men. The antipathy of Saxe and his friends was certainly not shared by either Margaret or her mother, unless they concealed their feeling with much skill, for the daughter addressed herself to Masters much of the time, and Mrs. West often included him in the conversation. By tacit agreement the subject of the miser's gold was not touched on by anyone, and the desultory talk ran the usual gamut of art, literature, the drama, and those innumerable topics that serve as the transient vehicles for individual wit and seriousness. It chanced that a decanter stood on the table, close to the edge, just by Billy Walker's right elbow. As he turned to address David on his left, his right arm was moved carelessly, and the decanter was jolted from its place. It poised for a second, balanced on its bottom edge, then fell over the side of the table toward the floor. But the time, brief as it was, had been sufficient for action on the part of Saxe. Naturally of exceeding rapidity of movement, although he held this under restraint ordinarily, so that he appeared rather languid than otherwise, an instantaneous responsiveness of his body to any command of the will had been cultivated by the years of exercise at the piano. So, now, on the instant when he perceived the touch of Billy's elbow to the decanter, he darted in a single step from his seat to a position behind Mrs. West's chair with arm outstretched, and in the same second, his nimble fingers had closed on the neck of the falling decanter, to which they clung tenaciously. Before he could again straighten himself, there came a thud against the east wall of the dining room, with it the sharp crack of a rifle, fired from close at hand. Saxe stood erect, stared dumbfounded at the others. They stared back at him, wordless for the moment, stupefied. Each looked at first one and then another, unable to surmise as to what had come upon them. It was Masters who finally broke the oppressive silence. The engineer's face was of a dead white, and as he spoke he tugged nervously at the luxuriant mustache. "Some hunter's been mighty careless," he declared. And Saxe's expression had grown very grave as he listened. There comes always to the normal man a shock on realizing the imminence of death for himself. The fact that the peril is past alters the nature of the shock, but it hardly lessens it. So, in the present instance, the young man, whose great risk was thus suddenly brought home to him, felt the thrill of deep emotion, in which thankfulness for the fate that had intervened in his behalf was strong. He said nothing for a few moments, nor did Roy, who, in his turn, was affected as he understood the danger that had menaced his friend. Masters uttered an ejaculation, which was indeterminate as to meaning. They found the others still in the dining room, and immediately learned that Billy Walker was quite willing to sacrifice his modesty on the altar of fact, for he greeted their return with a roaring statement. "Sax, my boy, I saved your life, and I hope you'll do me credit. From a study of the range of the trajectory of the bullet, I have learned that, had you been in your place at the table, the bullet would have penetrated your breast at a vital point. My clumsiness was the first cause of your escape. Examine for yourself." He waved a hand toward the sideboard. Sax, his face still grave, nodded assent. "I appreciate it, Billy," he said, "and I'll not forget it, you may be sure. Dave, too, thought of it." "Pooh, no thanks to me," Billy declared, embarrassed by the emotion in his friend's voice. "It was only by accident that I interfered, not by volition." "I know," Sax agreed. "But the fact remains that you were the instrument of salvation, and that is what I shall always remember." He looked toward Margaret West as he spoke, and saw that her face was very pale. He wondered how much of that pallor, if indeed any of it, had been caused by his own peril. For a fleeting second, the girl's limpid blue eyes met his, then they were veiled by the thick lashes. He found himself unable to read the meaning that had lain in them. He went to his chair, seated himself, and afterward twisted about to mark the precise line in which the bullet had passed. There could be no manner of doubt. Its course had been such that he could have escaped only by a miracle, had he been in his place. There could have been only a slight variation in the direction of the bullet, dependent on the position of the marksman. That variation could by no means have been great enough to save him from a grave, probably a mortal, wound. Sax shuddered, as the narrowness of his escape was again, and thus visibly, borne in on his consciousness. He looked about the cheery room and into the faces of the others with a sort of wonder in the realization that he was still of the quick, not of the dead. The wine of life took on new flavor. His gaze went again to Margaret. All went into the music room presently, still talking of the event that had been so close to tragedy, all except May Thurston. Without attracting any attention, she quietly slipped away from the others into the out-of-doors. There are times when one finds it well nigh impossible to analyze the workings of the mind, and it was so with this girl tonight. Suspicion had come to her. Suspicion sudden, terrible, irresistible, and she knew not whence it came. She fought against it in an effort of reason, but she fought in vain. She could not flee its clutch, strive as she would. In the end, she made abject surrender, and fled forth into the night, to learn whether suspicion taught her truth or a lie. May Thurston was a girl of much more than average intelligence. Native shrewdness had been sharpened by years of association with men of space between sideboard and chairs on that side of the table for Mrs. Dustin to pass in her service of the meals. The deliberate malignity of the plot was appalling to May, as she considered this naked revelation of it. She was pallid, shuddering, nauseated. The one thing that puzzled her for a time was the means by which the criminal had been able to secure the discharge of the rifle in his absence. It was plain that he had devised some method, so that he himself should be above suspicion, in the possession of a perfect alibi. It would, of course, be absurd for anyone to bring an accusation against him, when it was the common knowledge of all that he had been seated at the very table with the one against whom the attempt had been made. Yet, she failed to penetrate the method employed by him in firing the piece, and for a long time she puzzled over this in vain. Then, at last, her eyes were caught by a fragment of cord, which hung from the trigger of the rifle. A brief examination showed her that the loose end was charred by fire, and immediately she guessed the nature of the device that had been employed. She knew that Masters in his work had had much experience with explosives, and, in consequence, with fuses of various sorts. She understood on reflection that he had used in this instance a fuse of such length as to permit his lighting it a long time before the moment of firing. Afterward, he had been able to leave the rifle unattended, confident that at the instant designed by him it would be fired automatically by the burning of the fuse. But, a minute later, it occurred to her that the trigger required to be pulled backward in order to discharge the weapon. The parting of the string she had discovered could by no means affect this. She had let the obscuring branch swing back into place the while she meditated. Now, she again thrust it out of the way, so that the light shone in brightly, as she bent to another scrutiny of the rifle. Her investigation was instantly rewarded, for she perceived a coil of spring, which ran from the trigger to one of the branches. Its blackness had hidden it from her eyes hitherto. The discovery made all clear. The cord had held the trigger forward in its usual place, acting against the power of the spring. Then, the burning of the string by the fuse had left the trigger unprotected against the pull of the spring, which, suddenly effective, had fired the rifle. The ingenuity of the scheme confounded the girl, as she sat staring at the evidences of treachery. Yet, in that moment of anguish, she was moved to murmur a prayer of thankfulness that the knowledge of her lover's character had come to her in time to save her life from misery and degradation as his wife. After a long time crouched there in the tree, May bestirred herself slowly and clambered down, leaving the rifle as she had found it, with the bit of charred string hanging, and the spring holding the trigger pulled, as it had been at the moment of the shot. It did not occur to her that it might be wiser to carry away these proofs of attempted murder. Indeed, in that first understanding of the guilt of Masters, she was too distraught to think clearly. She could only feel the vicarious shame that was hers by reason of him to whom she had accorded her love. Nor did she just then speculate much as to the exact motive that had actuated the engineer. She took it for granted that he had been influenced to his course by motives of greed, as was the fact in the main. She supposed that he had thought the murder of Saxe Temple would cause a delay in the search, by which he might profit to the extent of finding the treasure himself. It did not occur to her that, his precious sixth sense without further investigation, he got out of bed, threw a bath robe over his pajamas, and set forth on a tour of investigation. There was still some moonlight shining through the windows of the hall, by which he was able to assure himself that nothing extraordinary was visible, nor did he hear any unusual sound. He descended into the lower hall, and there, too, his examination failed to show aught amiss. He moved with great caution, in order to avoid giving warning of his presence to a possible intruder, and peered into the office and the dining room. Everywhere, he found all in order. He betook himself, finally, to the door of the music room, which he found almost closed, but not quite. He pushed it open with much care, and bending forward, looked into the room. On the instant, his eyes were attracted by a light that shone clearly against the east wall of the room. By this illumination, he perceived a man, who knelt, holding a pocket torch in his left hand, while his right was thrust into an opening in the wall. Roy Morton stared in unqualified amazement. For the moment, his interest was centered on the aperture in the wall of the room, rather than on the man who knelt on the floor before it, with his arm thrust into the recess up to the shoulder. In that instant, Roy was seized with the conviction that he had stumbled upon the treasure of Abernethy by means of a monition from his sixth sense, and his heart was filled with gladness, both for the sake of his friend's fortune thus at last secured, and for the sake of his own pride in being the active agent in that consummation. He had no doubt whatever that the man crouched on the floor was Masters, though the face was unrecognizable in the shadow. He even suffered a little pang of jealousy that the fellow should have succeeded in discovering the golden treasury, while he and his friends had so signally failed. He comforted wounded vanity, however, with the trite reflection that all is well that ends well. It seemed, indeed, that the affair had now become simplicity itself, since there remained only to watch the operations of the thief, and ultimately to possess himself of the gold in his friend's behalf. It appeared to the observer that the position of the man on the floor left him subject to great disadvantage under attack, and that, therefore, it were wise not to delay action. Roy desired to capture the marauder single-handed for the sake of his own greater glory. He had no question as to his ability to overcome the engineer in a hand-to-hand contest, despite the fellow's excellent physique. With the idea of taking his enemy by surprise, he pushed the door farther ajar, to make space for a leap forward. Notwithstanding his caution, the hinges creaked with a sudden, harsh noise, which crashed through the silence of the night. In the same second, Roy sprang. At the sound of the opening door, the torch had clicked into darkness. There was the slithering of rubber-shod feet across the floor. As Roy came upon emptiness where had been the man, he heard the rustling of the drawn shade of a window. He saw dimly against the outer light the silhouette of the thief in the opening. Before he could move, it had vanished. He was after it with all speed, but, by the time he stood on the ground outside, he could neither see nor hear aught to give an idea as to the direction of the flight. He went forward blindly, moving here and there haphazard, pausing often to listen. There was no reward to his efforts, and, after a few minutes, realizing the uselessness of longer search, he returned to the cottage, where he entered the open window. It was just as he dropped to the floor that a cheering thought came to Roy. The man had carried away nothing in his flight. At the moment of the door's creaking, see Chapter 13 the clue. To the astonishment of Roy Morton and May Thurston, this day also passed without the appearance of the engineer at the cottage. The girl, at first experiencing some alarm over this protracted absence, was afterward filled with relief, when it occurred to her that Masters was keeping away because he had finally abandoned his evil intentions. She felt convinced that the failure of his attempt to murder Temple had brought him to realization of the heinousness of his conduct. The thought afforded her great satisfaction, since it relieved her of any necessity for action against him. The change in the situation so cheered her that she accepted with animation Roy's invitation to walk, and the two passed a particularly agreeable hour in strolling through the woods, finding each topic of conversation charming, and almost forgetting that such an one as the engineer encumbered the earth. There came another development in the evening, when the four friends were smoking and chatting, as was their custom after the ladies had retired for the night. They were in the music room with Sax at the piano, where he had been playing from time to time. Now, however, he had ceased, and rested motionless, with his eyes fixed on the sheet of manuscript left by Abernethy, in a wearisome wondering as to the message that might lie concealed within that bare presentment of the Song of Gold, as he had come to call the composition. Billy Walker had steadfastly maintained his belief that the clue to the treasure was hidden there, and Sax was impressed by the idea, although his reason declared it folly. Presently, Billy aroused himself from the luxury of the Morris chair, where he had been communing with an especially black cigar, heaved himself erect with a groan, and crossed the room to the piano. He stood for a little while in silence, staring down at the written page on the rack. "What's that?" he demanded. He pointed to the three measures that stood alone at the head of the sheet. "Listen." The phrase to which Billy Walker pointed was scrawled in a fashion that was rather slovenly as compared with the remainder of the manuscript. Hitherto, in spite of the many times he had studied the manuscript, Sax had given small heed to this fragment of writing, which preceded the Song of Gold. Now, however, at his friend's instigation, he examined it with scrupulous care before he spoke. Then, he shook his head in discouragement, as he struck the notes on the keyboard. "It doesn't mean anything, Billy," he declared. "But what's it there for, if it doesn't mean anything?" the other persisted. "Why," Sax answered, "I suppose it is simply that the old man had some sort of an idea, and jotted down a note concerning it. You see, it is at the top of the page. He did nothing more with it. Afterward, he used the same sheet to write the gold song on. He was a miser, you know. Yes, I know, Billy conceded. All the same, I think, in this instance, he would have been comparatively extravagant. I still believe that the bit there has some significance. Sachs shook his head emphatically. It can't mean anything, he repeated, drearily. He was fast yielding to discouragement. For a long minute the two were silent, regarding the manuscript intently, with knit brows. Then, of a sudden, Billy's rough voice boomed forth a question. Aren't there letters on a staff of music? What are the letters there? Sachs smiled, in some disdain. Much good may they do you, he said, and his tone was sarcastic. The letters are B, E, D, A, C. Might be a word in Magyar, for all I know. It isn't from any language more common, I fancy. Billy snorted indignantly. It's not altogether impossible that it should be a word from some language or other, he answered, stoutly. Of vital importance. You sneer at Vedic, which at first glance seems gibberish, and nothing more. There remains the possibility, nevertheless, that it may have a meaning of prime importance to you. A fortune may depend on your learning the meaning of that word. Don't dismiss it after just one glance. Don't sneer at it, and those two vertical lines. You say, they are void of purport. The fact is that they don't belong there, from your musical standpoint. Well, they're there, notwithstanding. The late Mr. Abernethy put them there. Perhaps they stood for something to him, in spite of the fact that they don't to you. Anyhow, don't sneer at them yet. Wait, at least, until you've really studied them. As far as our present knowledge goes, this paper must hold the clue. I tell you, it is worth working on, hard. The harsh, sonorous voice in this long harangue had soon cut short the desultory chat between Roy and David, who had listened almost from the beginning with attention, while smiling a little at the earnestness of the speaker in pursuing his argument. Well, Billy, David remarked, you're the one to work out the problem on logical lines. You've told the rest of us often enough that we can't reason. The other two nodded assent, smiling cheerfully on the nonplussed oracle. I'm horribly handicapped by my ignorance of music, he confessed, wryly. Then, his rough features settled into lines of resolve, and his voice fairly roared in the echoing room. But, by the Lord, I'll do it. I'll work that thing out, if I have to learn music first. There came a shout of laughter from the three. The vision of Billy Walker thus engaged was too ludicrous. Notwithstanding their merriment, there came no relaxation of the set purpose in the speaker's face. It was evident that he was wholly sincere in his announcement. Indeed, no sooner had the mirth exhausted itself than he craved a first lesson. Tell me about the letters that are on the staff, he besought Sachs, who good-naturedly complied, with a smile still on his lips. Then, that's all the letters there are in musical notation, Billy exclaimed, when the instructor paused. There was distinct disappointment in his voice. Only, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's bad. Yet there are two vowels, A and E is the most important vowel. He fell silent, standing moveless before the piano, with his gaze fixed on the manuscript in a brown study. Vedic, he muttered, after a little, and Sachs, hearing, smiled again. And those vertical lines, he mused aloud. Sachs kindly volunteered some information as to the purpose served by bars to separate the measures. When he ceased, Billy propounded a question, which was an affirmation. Then, there is a measure with nothing in it. Oh, in a way. Sachs replied. Only, this isn't really a measure. It's merely a mistake the old man happened to make, that's all. Why isn't it a measure? Came the crisp demand. Because, if it were really meant for a measure, it would contain something, either notes or rests, or both. You may thank your lucky stars I'm not a musician, Billy declared, and he snorted loudly in contempt. You're hide-bound, so to speak, by the technique of your art. Thank heaven, I have an open mind. Because the thing is different, you assert that it can't possibly have any meaning. For my part, on the contrary, the fact that it is different is just why I suspect it to be of importance. I give the late Mr. Abernethy credit for some cleverness. Also, I deem him to have been capable of a bit of originality. The manner of his will suggests that possibility, at least. If he amused himself by evolving a musical cipher, I'll warrant he didn't construct a mere tonic so fa, whatever that may be, which any piano banger could sing at sight to this tune here. I've always thought that much knowledge of technique was deadening. Now, the first fact of which I was possessed, Billy went on, thanks to the tuition in music afforded me by Sachs, was this, that the letters of the fragment are B, E, D, A, C, in such order. At the outset of my logical examination, I attempted variations in this order, as offering the simplest solution of the puzzle. After some experimenting, I became convinced that the secret was not concealed in a changed sequence of the letters. Next, then, I set myself to a consideration of the second fact. This consisted in the knowledge that the bit of music contained a measure that was not a measure. That is to say, there was the marking of a measure by two vertical lines, but nothing in that measure, neither notes nor rests. This impressed me as of importance in all probability. The same fact that led Sachs to disregard it, led me to scrutinize it with particularity. Again, Billy paused, to allow his hearers a moment in which to meditate on the shrewdness of his reasoning. When he went on speaking, his voice carried a note of increased contentment. Above this measure that is no measure, this measure that is empty, I perceived a pointer, of a size sufficient even to have attracted the notice of my friend here, hidebound in technique as he is, but it did not. The pointer directed attention straight to a letter placed exactly over the measure that isn't a measure because it is empty. That letter thus pointed out as L. It fitted very well into the blank place with the other letters. So, where before we had only B, E, D, A, C, we now have B, E, D, L, A, C. Billy ceased speaking, and surveyed the others happily. Well, why don't you go on? David demanded, impatiently. Billy regarded the questioner in genuine astonishment, tinged with contempt. His gaze darted to the other two, and, on realizing that they, as well, were still uncomprehending, he groaned. Non-rationalizing nincompoops, was his candid murmur of reprobation. Oh, well, I shall explain, if it be possible to your understanding, he said gently, with an assumption of infinite patience. As you musical sharps are aware, the musical notation comprises only 7 letters, namely. Oh, never mind that. Sachs cried. We know. Pardon me, was the retort. You only know it as a matter of technical knowledge, not as a fact from which to reason. The point is that there's no K in the musical scale. Well, the monosyllable snapped from Roy. His face was set intently, the chin a little forward, the eyes hard. The thing is simply this, Billy answered, beaming. The late Mr. Abernethy, on account of the lack of the letter K in the musical notation, was compelled to resort to an expedient. He could not indicate the word, lake, on his cipher, since he was without either L or K. He evaded the difficulty by employing the initial letter from a word of direction, largo, which provided the necessary L, and he got around the lack of the letter K by using the French word for lake, lac. This fragment at the head of the sheet spells for us, bedlac. He pointed to the phrase again, as he concluded. So, we have only to do a bit of translating from the French lac into the English lake, and then to amplify by supplying the obvious preposition and article, and the writing declares clearly. The bed of the lake. It now remains for us to study this page until we learn just where under the water of the lake out there the gold is lying. Somewhere, Somehow, this music tells. Chapter 14, the episode of the launch. The clue discovered by Billy Walker was accepted without hesitation. No secret was made of the information thus obtained as the rose from the leap, and tossed his head to clear the water from his eyes, chanced to be facing in its direction, and could see only a swirling mass of flames, darting onward toward the shore. Then, a cry startled him to concern over his companions. He turned quickly, and, to his relief, saw 4 heads appearing above the water. In the same instant, relief yielded to fear, for one of them vanished below the surface. It was David. Sax, who was a practiced swimmer, shot forward to the rescue in a powerful racing stroke. As he raised his head from the water a moment later, horror gripped him anew. Now, only 2 heads were showing. Billy had disappeared. But his emotion changed to delight as he covered the short distance between him and the place where David had sunk, for suddenly 2 heads rose above the water. He saw David supported in the arms of Billy, who was treading water in a lazy fashion all his own. That was the end of the actual peril. Sax aided David on the side opposite Billy, and the two had no difficulty, since David, though unable to swim, retained his coolness, leaving himself limp to the control of his rescuers. The land was less than 100 yards away, and thither the 5 wrecked men went, and clambered out upon the shore, bedraggled, dripping, scorched, half angry, half dazed by the suddenness of it all, but wholly thankful for their escape from the dual dangers of fire and flood. The chief mourner was Jake, who lamented with tears over the loss of the boat he had learned to love. Presently, the others began to rally Billy Walker on his unsuspected skill in the water. "When in the world did you ever learn to swim?" Roy demanded. "You didn't know how when you were in the university." "No such thing," Billy retorted, huffily. "I could swim before I was 7 years old." "But you never did swim during all the time I've known you," Sax exclaimed, astounded by the revelation. "Certainly not," was the crisp reply. "Why should I? Each person has just so much energy to draw on for his use, for all purposes whatever. I don't fritter my energy away on trifles, like swimming for mere amusement. I prefer to employ my vital forces in intellectual pursuits." He paused to grin maliciously at the others. "That's where I differ from you chaps. Yes. But, when the occasion arises, why, then I swim." Roy and Jake made a trip to the ruins of the motor boat, which had beached itself on the north shore, a quarter of a mile to the east of the point reached by the men. Meantime, the 3 others started at a leisurely pace to the west, skirting the shore until they rounded the lake, and turned to the south on their way to the cottage. Their rate of progress was so slow that within a half-hour Roy and Jake rejoined them, and with this completion of their number the speed was quickened. It was a full 5 miles to the cottage, but the sun and the breeze soon dried their clothing. The paths by which Jake led them wound through charming forest stretches. They were happy anew over the gracious gift of life. So, they swung forward with free footsteps through the miles. Even Billy Walker, who ordinarily would groan if required to stroll the distance from the cottage to the boathouse, seemed for once to have put off lethargy, for he marched at the head of the procession with Jake, and set the pace smartly. The full significance of the disaster was not revealed until the afternoon of the next day, when Jake returned from a second inspection of the wreck. His round, wizened face displayed evidences of excitement, and his tiny eyes were snapping, as he rushed into the presence of the 4 friends, who were taking their ease on the landing stage of the boathouse. "I found out something," he announced. There was a note of savageness in his voice that puzzled the hearers. "I been up to see the Scherzo, and I found out something." He stared with gloomy character. "Limit is exceeded. See Chapter 15 the chart." It was the belief of Sax and his friends that the person guilty of the outrage against them was none other than Hartley Masters. Now, at last, Roy confided to his associates the adventure in the night, when he had discovered the presence of the safe hidden within the wall. The others flouted him as he had anticipated over his failure to capture the intruder and his subsequent inability to learn the secret of the spring in the wainscoting. They accepted without hesitation his assurance that the night prowler had been Masters, and their wrath flamed hot against the engineer, who in his later effort had not scrupled to attempt the murder of 5 men. They determined to take active measures against the fellow for the sake of their own safety. Roy volunteered to wage a campaign against the enemy, to seek out his whereabouts, to trail him, to get evidence against him, and finally to make him prisoner. The others, meantime, would continue their quest for further clues to the treasure. First of all, they busied themselves with hunting for the concealed safe, after its exact situation had been indicated by Roy, and 3 days passed in fruitless experimenting on the intricacies of the carved wainscoting. Roy visited the hamlet at the foot of the lake, where was situated the hotel in which the engineer had been a guest. He learned, to his disappointment, that Masters had taken his departure a week before. He assured himself that this departure had been a real one by inquiries at the station. Further questioning of residents elicited the information that the engineer had thereafter been seen by none. Nevertheless, Roy was far from being convinced by this information that the engineer had actually taken himself off. He was, on the contrary, almost, if not quite, certain that Masters had merely made use of the train for an ostensible departure, in order to avoid the possibility of his presence in the neighborhood appearing as evidence against him in the event of any suspicion that might arise. Afterward, as Roy imagined, he had returned to some out-of-the-way place in the forest, where he could eat and sleep unmolested, and thence spy out the land for the execution of his villainous projects. Doubtless in his employment as an engineer, he had often lived roughly, and the season of the year would make life in the open no hardship. Roy, therefore, set himself to a search of the countryside, hoping somewhere to chance on a trace of the enemy's camp. In this, he was unsuccessful. After 2 days of weary tramping, it occurred to him that he could serve his purpose equally well by strolling in pleasant paths with May Thurston at his side. This improved method was adopted. Roy told the girl nothing as to his desire of finding Masters, but he told her other things plenty, and the two of them grew daily more content. It was Margaret West who finally hit on the spring that moved the wainscoting, for Sachs had let her know the story told by Roy, and she had amused herself by seeking to master the mystery. Actually, beyond her satisfaction in having succeeded where the others had failed, nothing was accomplished, since the vault was empty, and no hint as to the disposal of the gold could be gleaned from its bareness. Yet, new knowledge of the secret was soon to come. Billy Walker's pride of intellect had been aroused to the utmost by the difficulty of the task that confronted him. Hour after hour, day after day, he pored over the manuscript, of which the cryptic significance ever escaped all efforts of his ingenuity. It seemed to him that he had, in fact, scrutinized every possible aspect in which the writing might be viewed, and still the veil lay impenetrable over the mystery. He would have been in despair, had he been of a humbler mind, but his intellectual egotism would not suffer him to confess defeat, even to him. Detail. If not, of course I can do it. In time. Billy regarded his friends with an expression of intense self-satisfaction. Roy was sitting up in the hammock now, with his jaw thrust forward a little, and his eyes hard in the excitement of the minute. David was goggling, with his mouth open in amazement over the unexpected announcement. Sachs betrayed his emotion by the tenseness of his features, the rigidity of his pose, the sparkle in his keen, gray eyes. It was evident that the successful investigator was hugely enjoying the sensation he had created. He delighted in the importance of his accomplishment, gloried in the stunning effect of it on his companions. He smiled broadly, chuckled in a rumbling fashion of his own, and finally lighted one of his black cigars with irritating slowness. He rather hoped that someone might exclaim with impatience against this wanton delay, but none did. They endured the suspense in apparent calm, moveless, expectant. So at last, Billy deigned to proceed with the account of his achievement in solving the mystery contrived by the miser. "I owe the final suggestion by which I won out to Sax," he declared frankly, with an appreciative nod in his friend's direction. "He, however, really deserves no credit, since what he did was merely by chance, without any intention, and would never have amounted to anything, if it hadn't been for the fact that I happened to see what he had done, and to take advantage of it in an orderly and logical way. Only, I wish it understood that he served as the unconscious instrument of destiny in the matter, and as such unconscious instrument he should be recognized. Probably, I should have arrived at the fact in time without his aid, but to it I owe success on this present occasion." "What in the world did I do?" Sax demanded, in amazement. "I'll explain in a minute," Billy replied. "I have in mind first to exhibit this to you." He held up a sheet of paper, which he had drawn from his pocket. It was of about the size of that on which Abernethy's composition had been written. It showed 2 irregular lines running across it, drawn by pencil. "Glance at this, if you please," he directed. The others did so, but their bewildered expression showed that they were still unenlightened as to the bearing of the scant diagram on the revelation concerning the hidden gold. Billy chuckled again in contemplation of their failure to comprehend. Then, he brought forth a second sheet, and held it, also, for their inspection. In this instance, the paper was turned with its greater length horizontal, and the 2 lines of the other sheet had been joined, so that the one irregular tracing extended over the full page. David slapped his thigh with violence. "By the Lord Harry, it is a map!" he cried, in glee. "A regular map, Billy, my boy." His eyes bulged forth until they threatened to jump from their sockets. Roy's jaw shot out a bit farther. "Yes, it is a map," he agreed, and his voice was strangely gentle, as it usually was in his moments of greatest excitement. "It's a map. Bully for Billy." His face lighted with a charming smile, and his eyes grew soft as he turned them to the rough-hewn face of the discoverer, who appeared highly gratified. Sax took the sheet of paper out of his friend's hand, and studied it with eager eyes. For the first time in days, hope leapt in his breast. "Yes, it is a map," he declared, echoing the others. "But I don't understand. Tell us, Billy." Billy actually preened himself, in an ungainly manner peculiarly his own, and assumed a most pedantic air, as he went forward with the explanation. Sax was sitting here, with his eyes fixed on the old man's manuscript, but with his mind elsewhere. "I was here in my chair, with all the power of my brain concentrated on that same manuscript, trying to get some suggestion for working out the tangle. Was it merely restlessness? See Chapter 16. The hold. Billy's vanity was well content with the compliments accorded him by his friends, who gave the appreciation that was justly his due for persistent effort when they had wearied. It was David whose enthusiasm led him to suggest an immediate trip on the lake, to learn whether or not they could identify the features of the topography shown by the chart. The launch, to which they had been reduced by the loss of the Scherzo, had a speed of 12 miles an hour at its best, and under Jake's guidance it carried them swiftly enough northward to the broadest part of the lake, whence they might readily study the shore in all directions. Already, each had familiarized himself with the chart, so that it was held clearly in a mental picture, while he looked about over the sweep of skyline critically, seeking some resemblance in the rise and fall of mountain and hill and in the curving of the shore to the irregular tracing made by Billy from the music. As the boat ran in a wide circle, first one and then another caught here or there some trick of configuration that sent him eagerly to compare it with the chart in Billy's hands. But, in each instance, the hope was doomed to swift disappointment, for vital divergence was revealed between the two. There was some disagreement, too, as to whether or not the map had reference to the windings of the shore, or to the crests and valleys of the hills and mountains, as they showed in relief against the sky. Billy Walker was certain that the chart had been drawn to represent the sky line, and Sax was of the same opinion, chiefly, perhaps, because of the other's reasoning in which he had come to have great confidence, if not absolute reliance. Billy argued that the sky line would be the natural guide on which to depend, inasmuch as it was bolder, less open to doubts. The indication received from this, he pointed out, could be at once applied to the shore, since the first knowledge gleaned had declared that the treasure was at the bed of the lake. Both Roy and David, however, maintained that the chart should be taken as copying the indentations in a portion of the shore line. David offered evidence in support of this contention to the effect that, whatever the sky line might show as to itself, there could come from it no hint as to the distance from the shore at which the gold was lying. Billy admitted this, and then to his adversary's chagrin, exposed the fact that the like difficulty must exist in the event of the map being of the shore line itself, which was not to be gainsaid. It was Sachs who, at last, made the discovery of importance. He had been staring fixedly at one point of the horizon for a full minute. Then, he moved over to Billy's side, where he alternately regarded the chart and the horizon for a considerable interval. "Look here, Billy," he exclaimed, abruptly. "Just take a squint at Mount Tabor, over there. I learned the name from Jake the other day." He pointed to the west, a little to the north of them, where one of the highest of the peaks of the distant mountains loomed in naked majesty. Billy obeyed the request, and readily distinguished the peak to which Sachs had called his attention. "Well?" he questioned. "I want you to notice, too," Sachs continued, "that the peak is flat on the top for some distance, and that there's nothing of much height to the south." Billy nodded in assent. "All right," he agreed. "Go on. Now, look farther north, about 2 miles, or perhaps more. You see another mountain, which seems to be almost the same height as Mount Tabor, and is flat on top in the same way." There was hardly any delay before Billy answered. "Yes, I see it. Next." "Well, then," Sachs continued, with animation, "you must bear in mind the fact that those 2 peaks are the highest on the whole extent of the western shore of the lake. It is, I imagine, very likely that character limit is exceeded. For our purposes, with a single small exception, we don't know where the gold is. Nevertheless, the chart will tell us. It's there, somewhere. Sachs has done nobly in coming to my assistance. It seems to me that, now, it is the turn of either Roy or Dave." Billy laughed, and then assumed an expression of elephantine demureness. "Roy is something of an expert in occult things," he suggested, with his eyes twinkling. "It might be a good idea for him to try his powers on this. The divining rod, in the hands of the gifted, will locate precious metals, as well as water, under the surface of the earth. Doubtless, it will do as much for gold under water. It is probable that Jake can inform us as to where witch hazel is to be found in the woods. With a twig of that for wand. I believe it is the accepted wood. Let Roy go wandering over the lake in the launch. Let him hold the divining rod in his hand until it shall dip toward the water. Let a buoy be floated there to mark the spot, and there will we dredge, and there will we bring up the old man's treasure." Roy sniffed, while Sachs and David smiled over Billy's bombast. But Jake took the suggestion seriously, and nodded his approval. "A loose hern it would find gold and silver," he said, "but I hain't never seen it done. It's fine for water, though, and that I know, haven't seen it work many a time. It bent, and they dug, and the water come, and that's all they was to it." 2 hours after he had retired that night, Billy Walker was rudely awakened out of a sound sleep. In a dream, which had been of a curious, but most agreeable heaven, where he was dining on dishes that were puzzles, each one to be solved before it could be eaten, he was instantaneously transported to a vile groggery of the water front in a seaport town, where a horde of rapscallions pounced on him with intent to Shanghai. He awoke to behold in the moonlight Sachs, who sat on the edge of the bed, jolting him violently to and fro. When his brain was sufficiently clear, he demanded the meaning of this outrage. The first words from his friend were consolation enough. "Billy," I've found the place." There was no need for apology, since the disturber of his slumbers had brought to Billy Walker the news he most desired. Instantly, he was questioning. "Quick, tell me. How'd you find it? Where is it?" Sax laughed happily. "I must give you one final lesson in music, to enable you to understand. It's so simple. I can't guess why I didn't get it in a second. The most obvious thing is often the most obscure," came the oracular paradox. A hold in music, Sax explained, is a mark which shows that a certain note is to be sounded for a time longer than is demanded by its value otherwise. Well, there was excitement in the harsh whisper. "Wait until I've lighted the lamp," Sax said. In a moment it was done. "Now, take another glance at the gold song itself, not the chart." He pulled the sheet from a pocket of the dressing gown that he wore over his pajamas, and held it up before Billy's face for inspection. "Listen, that shaded half-circle," Sax went on, with a period in the concavity, over the second measure of the second half of the gold song, "is a hold. A hold. A hold, Billy. Don't you understand? Isn't it plain? That marks the spot where the gold is." "I know it does. That's the place where we pause, where we hang on." "Of course." Billy Walker's voice had a tone of complete satisfaction. "You've done splendidly, Sax. With much training, I believe I might be able to make something out of your intellect. The chart will show just what part of the shore is indicated by this hold. The gold will be at that point. Probably, close to the bank, but certainly under the water, for the first lesson read, the bed of the lake. We shall find it without Roy's divining rod, after all." Loathing for his crimes. Masters must have understood perfectly the uselessness of all effort to persuade her from her purpose, for he wasted not an instant in argument. Instead, he acted. Before Roy could make a movement to interfere, the engineer had leapt forward. His long, powerful fingers closed in a strangling grasp on the soft, white throat of the girl, sank viciously into the tender flesh. May's eyes protruded, her arms straightened out in a spasm of physical anguish, but no sound issued from the parted lips. Almost in the same second, Masters shifted his grip with lightning speed to her waist, lifted her easily, and swung her from the cliff out into space. Then, he went crashing off into the wood, running blindly, ere yet came the splash made by the girl's falling body as it entered the water. Perhaps Masters did not hear the second splash, which followed after the briefest interval. If he heard, and thought of it at all, he probably deemed it caused by some rock his movement had set rolling over the cliff. Assuredly, he never dreamed that there had been at hand a man to plunge after his victim, to save her from the death to which he had assigned her. In his intimacy with May, he had learned that she could not swim. In that deep water, where the naked cliff rising vertically offered no hand-hold, she, in her dazed condition, could have no chance to escape alive out of the peril into which his cruelty had cast her. Such was the engineer's belief, and his feeling was merely of satisfaction in thus having rid himself of the witness who knew his blood guiltiness. Even as his body clove the air in the long dive to the water, Roy was conscious of a pang of regret that he must suffer the enemy to escape. Then, he was beneath the surface, groping vainly. As his head shot clear again, his eyes glimpsed May's head just disappearing near at hand. In a moment, he had reached her, was in time to seize her before she sank again. He was at home in the element, and, as the girl was unconscious, and so offered no resistance by a struggle, his task was all the easier. He quickly brought her to the shore, at a point where there was a break in the cliff, and the ground sloped sharply to the level above. He did not pause until he had carried her in his arms to the top of the bank. There, he laid her face downward on the ground, then lifted her by the waist, so that the lungs might empty themselves of water. Afterward, he chafed her face and hands, and soon, to his great relief, she showed signs of returning consciousness. As she had been immersed for so brief a time, she speedily made a complete recovery, save for the weakness consequent to the shock of the whole experience. Indeed, her wretchedness was rather from the violence of the engineer's attack than from the little water she had swallowed before her rescue by Roy. It was after the first confused questioning on her part, and Roy's account of his presence on the scene, that she gave an explanation of the events that had led to the attempt against her life. She, too, had sought relief from wearisome wakefulness by wandering abroad in the night. While she was close to the cottage, yet in the shadows of the wood, she had heard a sound that attracted her attention, and had watched carefully. There was a long silence before her interest was rewarded, but at last, she made out a movement on the north wall of the cottage itself, which was only a little way from her. Observing closely, she perceived that the object was a man, who was descending a ladder. It needed no more to fill her with alarm, and with fear came suspicion, which was almost certainty, as to the identity of the prowler. At first, however, she remained quiescent, doubtful as to her right course of conduct, anxious, if it were in any wise possible, to avoid alarming the household. During her period of delay, the man disappeared with the ladder, but he returned character limit as exceeded. Not a bit of it, he asserted. I can reproduce that music in 10 minutes, every mark on it. I know where the hold was, exactly. For that matter, I don't need the music. The chart will do just as well, for I know the place on it, too. But I'll do the music over for Bill and the rest of you. I'll do it as soon as I'm dressed, before I come down to breakfast. And as he said, so was it. When he appeared at the breakfast table, he carried with him an exact duplicate of the old miser's manuscript. There was much lively interest on the part of all, when the adventure of the night was made known, and May on her appearance was hailed as a heroine of melodrama. To the astonishment of all save Roy perhaps, the girl was more radiant than they had ever seen her hitherto, and the color in her cheeks and the brilliance of her charming eyes, now undisfigured by the businesslike lenses of the secretary, rendered her beauty so striking that the men regarded her with new admiration, while Margaret West, from the instinct of a woman whose own heart is full of tenderness, regarded her friend with a gentle suspicion that there remained something of the adventure yet untold. Roy was eager to devote the day to a search for the capture of Masters, but the others were opposed to this. It was finally decided that the quest for the hiding place of the treasure must be carried on without a moment of delay, since the matter of the short time now remaining, only a week, could not be ignored. As to the evil devices of the engineer, it would be sufficient to take precautions against them by keeping watch through the coming night and afterward until the end of the hunt for the gold. So, as soon as breakfast was done, the four friends set out in the launch with Jake for a survey of the territory indicated by the hold. This, as was clearly apparent from examination of the manuscript, was on the lake shore at a point opposite one of the low peaks. It was easily distinguished by its nearness to the second of the highest summits, as it was at the first point of rise after a long descent. The course brought them again to the north end of the lake, to a place close to the extreme end. There was a cove here, which ran inland for a half-mile. Within the curve of the shore, a few small islands were scattered, and outside the miniature bay a larger island stretched, one of the chief on the lake. It was Roy who now assumed charge of the expedition, by right of his varied experience in wild places, which had included the tracking of cattle rustlers and outlaws. He directed that first a landing should be made, and the shore at the point indicated gone over carefully for any slightest trace of footsteps, or other marks, which might show operations in connection with the removal of the treasure. If found, such a trail would doubtless guide them in their further quest of the gold at the bottom of the lake. They spent 3 hours at the work, and finally abandoned it in despair, for their investigation had been exhaustive, without revealing aught. Billy Walker delivered himself forcibly, when at last a council was called. Since he had toiled steadfastly with the others, notwithstanding his distaste for physical exertion, there could be no question as to his sincerity when he argued against any further effort in this direction. I've learned from Jake, he explained, that the late Mr. Abernethy understood the management of his boats perfectly, and on occasion used them without taking anyone along to help him. It is, therefore, reasonable to suppose that he would have transported the money to its hiding place in one of the powerboats. He had no horse, and his feebleness was such that he could not have lugged all that weight of gold, even if he divided it into small amounts, for this place is 4 miles from the cottage, almost as far as we walked the other day. Now, we know that there's a cave on that island. Sachs regarded the girl in dismay. This information was not what he had anticipated. He did not know just what he had expected, but certainly it had been nothing like this. A cave, he exclaimed, weakly. But the gold's at the bottom of the lake, you know. Margaret moved her head in assent. Yes, I know, she agreed. She was not in the least disconcerted by the obvious disappointment on the part of her listener. On the contrary, a mischievous dimple pitted the rose of her cheek. Just the same, the cave might have something to do with your affair. I don't understand, Sachs objected. The cave runs downward, she said, and she waited for the meaning of her words to penetrate his consciousness. They did so, presently. Oh, the cave runs downward, he repeated, thoughtfully. I begin to understand. Margaret met his gaze frankly, and nodded assent to the idea that had arisen in his mind. Yes, she went on, the cave is really larger than you might fancy from the size of the island, and the passage slopes downward, though not very steeply. We didn't go far. I don't know the length of it. Cousin Horace didn't know. Then, in the cave, there are plenty of places where the gold could have been hidden. So, I thought I'd tell you. Bless your dear heart, Sachs cried. I believe you've saved the day for us. The chances are, we'd never have got to searching the island even, without your help. You might have missed the cave, if you had gone over the island, Margaret said. It isn't at all easy to find, I can tell you. I don't know how my cousin happened on it. He told me that, as far as he knew, there was no one else aware of its existence. A great volume of sound shattered the air. The two turned toward the boathouse, and saw Billy Walker, who made an imperative gesture, and shouted again. All ready. Hurry along. But, as Sachs turned to the girl, to say goodbye, she stayed him. Wait, she commanded. I don't wish the others to know, yet. You see, it might come to nothing, after all. How would it do, if I were to go with you in the canoe? Then we could land on the island, and investigate, and afterward, if you found things promising, you could tell the others. What do you think? Sachs was in a whirl of delight. Thus far, he had never enjoyed the like opportunity to be with the girl whom he loved. His heart leapt at the thought of it, and his eyes were tender and happy as they met hers. What do I think of it? He repeated. His voice was so charged with adoration that the rich color flooded Margaret's cheeks. Why, I think it will be splendid. Shall we start right away? The girl laughed, in some confusion, and her glance wandered from him. Not this very second, she protested, for I must change into something different for paddling. Go down and send the others along, and I'll be with you in 10 minutes. No, 15. Sachs, waiting on the dock with the canoe already launched, smiled a trifle grimly, and admitted that the dearest woman in the world was essentially feminine, for his watch indicated the half-hour since their parting. It was just as he slipped the timepiece back into his pocket that he heard the laughing voice behind him. I'm just on time to the second, am I not? Sachs turned, to see Margaret, in workmanlike gray sweater and short skirt. His gaze, though fond, was mildly reproachful. It's been just half an hour, he declared. Then, I'm on time, to the second as I said. The girl beamed on him, quite unabashed. At this astonishing statement, Sachs opened his eyes in wonder. Ah, I know now, she exclaimed joyously. Yes, it is here, see. While speaking, she had hastened forward, and now, as she finished, she pointed to where a clump of bushes grew against the north cliff of the ravine. Above the tops of the branches showed a rift in the stone. It was less than a foot in width, a splotch of blackness hardly more noticeable than a deeper shadow. Sax, beholding, was filled with gratitude to his guide. "We'd never have found it in 1,000 years, he declared. "Besides, why should we ever hunt for the bed of a lake on the top of an island? Mr. Walker would have evolved a reason for it in the course of time," Margaret said, in a voice charged with profound respect for the sage. "Yes, I believe Billy would have worked it out. In time," Sax agreed. "But," he added, with a smile, "perhaps not in time, according to the terms of the will." "There's another entrance, on one of the ridges near the shore," Margaret explained. "Cousin Horace stumbled on that first. He showed it to me. But he found this way out, and it is better. He said the other was very hard climbing." The two had gone forward, and now they were close to the cliff, beside the bushes. Here, Margaret thrust aside the branches, and, advancing a step behind them, showed the entrance to the cave, which was a slit less than a yard in width at the base, narrowing to the apex a rod above. It yawned blackly. Sax was reminded that he had taken no thought as to the need of candles or lantern. He began the confession of his carelessness, but the girl stopped him. "I brought a pocket torch," she said. "See." As she spoke, she drew the tube from a pocket of her sweater, pressed the spring, and lighted up the entrance to the cave. "What a girl you are!" Sax cried. There was that in his voice which set Margaret a tremble. "Come," she commanded hastily. With the word, she walked forward into the cavern. Behind her in the narrow passage, Sax followed obediently. Chapter 19. In the cavern. The passage continued of limited width for a number of rods. The floor lay almost level, smooth enough to make going easy. The light from the torch showed only walls of bare rock on either side, and once, when Margaret turned the rays upward, the narrowing slant to an apex far above their heads. The two explorers went in silence. Sax thought the footing safe enough so that he could content himself with watching the girl, whose every motion was a delight to him, seen dimly in the glow that penetrated from without. He was not minded to waste many glances on barren cliffs, while so much of living beauty went in buoyant grace there before him. Margaret, however, gave no apparent attention to aught save the immediate business of the moment, which was holding her gaze to the path lighted by the torch. And so they came presently into a spacious chamber within the earth. As the two entered here, Margaret halted, and Sax eagerly stepped to her side. The girl flashed the torch here and there, to reveal the nature of the place. Sax guessed that the room had a diameter of about 50 feet. The walls of ragged rock formed an uneven circle. They bent inward in the ascent, with a dome-like effect, to a height of hardly 20 feet. Margaret wasted no time. After one examination of the walls by the torch, she fixed the light on a portion of the side opposite them, a little to the left. Sax, peering intently in this direction, thought that he detected two patches of shadow, a little denser than the surrounding dark, which might be the openings into other tunnels. The girl's words proved his surmise right. "There are two passages over there, close together," she announced. "As I remember, the one we followed was that on the right. Of course, the money might be hidden anywhere. But we might go a little way in that passage first, so that you'll understand how it runs downward." Character limit is exceeded. Cavern was far from pleasant to either of them. The girl's anxiety was revealed in the next question. "Have you matches?" With a start of dismay, Sax recalled that he had left his match safe in the pocket of his coat, which remained in the canoe. Nevertheless, he made a perfunctory search. "No," he admitted reluctantly. "I left them in the canoe." He heard the girl sigh, but she said nothing more, only hastened her steps. The dimming of the torch was very apparent now. The two scrambled over the hewn venices of the passage with what haste they might. Sax congratulated himself on the fact that there had been no other passages branching from that in which they had made the descent, for the turns, while never sharp, had been frequent enough to breed perilous confusion were there need of choice. In the next instant, however, he remembered the abstraction of his thoughts during the traversing of the route, and he was filled with self-reproach at the realization that, after all, there might have been such branches. And, just then, the two halted abruptly, arrested by a sudden consciousness of the truth. They were descending. For a moment, neither spoke. In that little interval, the feeble glow of the torch died out altogether. There came a gasp of dismay from Margaret. Sax's clasp on her hand tightened in the instinct of protection. Then he essayed a cheerful laugh, albeit there was small merriment in it. "Now," he declared briskly, "we must stop right where we are until we've planned a campaign. This is a real adventure." Even as he spoke, miserably aware of the serious predicament into which the going out of the torch had plunged them, he was conscious of the delicate fragrance of her hair, so near his lips, and the vague, yet penetrant, perfume that exhaled from her to the ravishing of his senses. He fought manfully against the temptation to draw her to his breast, as every fiber of him besought. Under the stress of desire denied, his voice came with a ring of imperiousness. "I had a lot of experiences in caves, when I was a boy. This thing will be easy." "But we're going downward," Margaret faltered. The mystery of the event had sapped courage. "Exactly," Sax conceded. "Somewhere, we turned off into a branch passage." "Did you know of any branch?" "No," came the answer. The inflection of distress gave new strength to the temptation that beset him. "I should have noticed it on the way down," Sax confessed, in great bitterness of spirit, "but my mind was wool-gathering." The girl ventured no question. Perhaps she guessed the nature of that distraction. "Anyhow, we've managed to leave the passage in which we came down. We couldn't have turned around in it, without knowing the fact. It seems to me that we've only to face about, and make our way upward again, merely watching out that we don't get switched off another time. The ascent will surely take us back by one or the other of the two corridors into the big room above." "But, if it should not?" Margaret stammered. The woe in her voice was pitiful. "Why, we might. Here in the dark. No light. No food. Oh." Sax spoke with a manner of authority. "Stop. Don't imagine things. Worry wastes strength. Save yours for this exciting climb through the dark. There's no danger, that I know." The calm confidence with which he contrived to charge his voice soothed the girl, and restored to her some measure of courage. From his position on the left side of her, he put out his free hand, and touched the wall. "Put out your right hand," he bade her, "until it reaches the wall. Now, we'll turn round, and begin the journey in the right direction. Keep in touch with the wall, please. Move slowly, using your feet in place of eyes, to avoid stumbling." In this fashion, they set forth through the blackness of the cavern. It was slow and tedious going. It had been tiresome enough when chapterxx the events of a night. Since the large chamber was in utter darkness, Sax decided on recourse to a device which had served him well in similar situations of his boyhood among the mountains. As soon as Margaret moved and drew a little away from him, he spoke. "We must step back to the passageway," he said. "From it, I can take our bearings, so that we can cross the place without floundering about haphazard in the dark." "Yes," the girl answered. Her voice came very low, quavering a little. 2 paces brought them again to the entrance of the corridor. There, with a hand touching either side, Sax made sure of the exact direction in which he faced, and from this he judged his course, for he remembered the relative positions of the passage by which they had come into the big room and of the shadows he had seen on the opposite wall. He had in mind as well his estimate of the diameter of the chamber, and so, when he had made sure of his direction he set off boldly, after again taking Margaret by the hand. He lengthened his stride a trifle, to make it the measure of a pace. When he had counted 15 steps, he reduced his speed, and moved with caution, groping before him. A moment later, his hands encountered the wall. He was confident that he had held his course fairly straight in crossing the chamber, and was certain, in consequence, that the opening into the passage must lie a little to his left. He therefore drew Margaret in this direction. An instant later, to his joy, his left hand found emptiness. Without a word, the two hurried forward, and presently they saw before them a dim glow that was the first hint of outer light. Saxe fell behind the girl as the passage narrowed. Margaret quickened her steps to a run, and he held fast at her heels. In the same second with her, he issued from the cavern, and sent forth a huge shout, which was a little for escape from the cave, but chiefly for a primitive, masterful delight in the woman beside him. Margaret smiled sympathy with his mood, and her smile, it may be, was divided in its sources, even as was the lover's cry of triumph. The girl's face was mantled with blushes. But she spoke bravely, with a dainty air of inconsequence. "Why, how late it is!" She pointed toward the west. "See, the sun has set already, we were in there for ages." "Yes," Saxe agreed. "And it is like rebirth to come back. Rebirth into a new, glorious life." With an effort, he checked himself, for he would not embarrass her now, though passion bubbled to his lips. "We must paddle over to where the rest are, and let them know about the cave at once." The news brought by the two created a lively excitement among the others, along with a considerable feeling of relief, for the continued absence of Margaret and Saxe had been inexplicable, until Billy Walker quoted, with ostentatious carelessness, "Love's a virtue for heroes, as white as the snow on high hills, and immortal as every great soul is that struggles, endures and fulfills." At this utterance from the seer, who was by no means prone to sentimental rhapsodizing, Roy appeared at first puzzled, then enlightened, and he smiled. Nor speculated more as to the whereabouts of his missing friend, while David grinned appreciatively, and accepted the innuendo as a sufficient explanation of Saxe's absence even in this crisis of affairs. For the rest, the three, with some assistance from Jake, had passed a busy afternoon, without accomplishing anything beyond a disheartening certainty that the gold had been very effectually concealed. Much of the cove was shallow, and Billy Walker had suited his convenience by pursuing his investigations of these portions from the launch which Jake guided to and fro as required. The clearness of the water made it possible to see the bottom distinctly except at the greatest depths, and in this comfortable fashion Billy conducted his character. "I shan't need a gun," Roy declared superciliously, and his pugnacious jaw was thrust forward yet once again. And, afterward, when Jake had accompanied him to the cavern with the blankets and the lighted lantern, the boatman's well-meant offer to remain for the night was rejected almost with indignation. "You don't understand, Jake," Roy said, venomously. "I personally have an account to settle with that infernal engineer." The old man grinned a cheerful appreciation of the situation. "Of course," he remarked, in a matter-of-fact tone, "you got quite some hefty grudge agin I am for the way he ducked your sweetheart." At this candid statement, Roy gaped in amazement. "Why, how did you know she—" he began. Then, he halted in confusion. For the first time in many years, he felt himself incapable of speech. Jake chuckled in high good nature, and deemed that explanation enough. "Well, Lick, I am good, if ye catch, I am," he exhorted, and straightway set out on his return to the cottage, where he and David were to serve as guards throughout the night. Thus left to his own devices, Roy proceeded to make himself as comfortable as the circumstances of his situation would permit. He was sure that the enemy would not appear on the scene for some time yet, if at all, and in the interval before that possible coming he proposed to make himself at ease. To this end, he placed the lantern in the center of the chamber on the floor, and folded the blankets into a comfortable rug, on which he seated himself cross-legged, according to the fashion he had learned to like in the Far East. He was at pains to have the luncheon basket conveniently placed before him, and now began an investigation of its contents with a curiosity sharpened by keen appetite. He smiled contentedly as he brought out a cold sliced fowl, fresh salad, a vacuum bottle of hot coffee, the dozen other things that would have made a formidable array, had it not been for the strength of hunger with which he happily confronted them. As he renewed energy with this repast, Roy smiled at the contrast of its luxuriousness, as compared with many another that had been his lot in the wild places. He was alone in the wilderness, as often of old, but there the similarity ceased, for in those other places, there had been no dainties, such as the ones before him, no napkins of damask, or utensils of silver. And yet, Roy broke off his musings, as he finished his third cigarette, and set himself to make arrangements for the night. He removed his blankets to a point against the wall of the cavern on the side opposite the entrance, where a tiny recess offered partial concealment. In this nook, he spread out the blankets, extinguished the lantern, stretched himself in a comfortable posture, and thus entered on the long vigil. He did not hesitate to doze, as he was sure that he retained his old habit of becoming alert at the faintest sound. It was hours afterward when he became broad awake in an instant. For a time, he lay motionless, all his senses quickened. The blackness of the chamber seemed impenetrable, yet his eyes stared steadfastly into the dark, expectant for aught that might befall. It was on hearing, however, that he depended chiefly to gather information, and his ears were set keenly. Yet, though he listened so intently, minute after minute passed, and there was no least interruption of the perfect silence. Roy found himself in a quandary. He gave Masters credit for a shrewdness equal to the known unscrupulousness of the fellow. Undoubtedly, the engineer had lurked on some vantage spot of the shore throughout the day, and by this espionage had light now that he made sure of being very close to the cause of it, and renewed the exercise of all his caution as he crept forward. That this was none too much, nor, indeed, enough, was shown by what presently followed. Roy paused again, to examine the situation in detail. The brilliance of the light now assured him that its source was shut from him only by a single bend of the tunnel, which was hardly a rod in front. It was plain, then, that the time had come for determining the manner of his attack, since the moment could not be long delayed. He had no intention of resorting to the weapon with which David had equipped him. He planned that he would approach the turning of the passage noiselessly, and seek to reconnoiter from that point without being observed. Thereafter, as opportunity should serve, he would steal upon his enemy unaware, overpower the fellow, handling him with roughness enough to afford some adequate satisfaction for the outrage against May Thurston, and finally, when the villain had been reduced to passivity, hold him prisoner, to which purpose, at last, the automatic might prove convenient. The arrangement was admirably simple. There remained but to test its efficacy. The length of tunnel thus traversed by Roy in his pursuit had been considerable. Throughout the latter portion, the slope had been downward, with frequent variations from a sharp incline to stretches almost level. In the place to which he had now attained, the slant was scarcely perceptible. At this distance from the big chamber, he had long passed beneath the waters of the lake. The location of the treasure might well be anywhere hereabouts, according to the saying of the miser's cipher. Roy was moved to devouring curiosity to learn whether or no the man ahead of him had in truth come upon the gold. If so, the accomplishment should avail the scoundrel little, he vowed, and his jaw was thrust forward, as once again he advanced. Roy looked to the placing of his feet for every step, neglecting no precaution to avoid aught that might give warning of his approach. In this stealthy fashion, he came to the turning of the tunnel, and then, after another delay to make sure that his presence remained unsuspected, he ventured to peer into the passage beyond the bend. His heart exulted. Surely, fate had delivered his enemy into his hand. 100 feet beyond the corner from which Roy looked, a lantern was set on the floor of the passage. This was the source of the light that he had trailed so painstakingly. It burned clearly. The radiance from it showed all about with distinctness. The conspicuous thing on which the beams shone was the form of Masters, who was kneeling and gazing fixedly down into an opening in the floor of the cavern. The man was on the farther side of this, and so had his face toward the watcher, but absorption in whatever was displayed beneath him prevented his noticing the presence of the newcomer. Roy was, therefore, able to continue his spying at ease. Curiosity, as well as discretion, bade him delay attack. He was eager to learn the nature of the engineer's interest in the opening, and, too, the fellow's position, facing up the tunnel, rendered impossible at the moment a rush that should take him by surprise. Undoubtedly, the engineer would make some movement presently, which would place him more conveniently for Roy's purpose. In the meantime, it would be enough to observe, and to await the right instant for assault. It may be that Masters, too, possessed a sixth sense. Roy could never be convinced that there was not something uncanny in the events that now immediately followed. Masters jumped down into the opening, where he stood with only head and shoulders exposed. Then, in an instant, the light of the lantern vanished. With that, the crash of a .45, thunderous there within the cavern. See Chapter 21. The First Pit. At the cottage that same night, Margaret made an excuse of fatigue, and withdrew to her chamber immediately when dinner was done, to the discomfiture of Sax. May Thurston, too, vanished, perhaps because Roy was absent, and she preferred solitude in order that she might think of him without interruption. Presently Mrs. West said good night, and the three friends were left alone in the music room. It was then that Sax proposed to give to Billy Walker some information he had received from Margaret during their return trip in the canoe. "I've found out who was in this room when you fell through the ceiling," Sax said to the sage. "Oh, that," Billy retorted contemptuously. "It was of no importance. I didn't bother to tell you." "Do you mean," Sax demanded, in astonishment, "that you know already?" "Certainly," was the crisp answer. It was Chris. But how? Elimination. There was no problem of interest. But, only a kindergarten form of ratiocination required, the sage went on, with an air of extreme boredom. "'Cause family devotion. Aged and faithful servitor didn't mean to let you deprive daughter of his mistress of her share of the money. Meant to beat you to it, like Masters, but from a different motive, merely to keep it away from you until the time limit should expire. Then, he observed symptoms between you and the said daughter that convinced him of error in his plans. Made him realize that keeping the money away from you would end in depriving her of half the gold while giving her a half. Being emotional and devoted, he confessed to the girl. The girl felt it her duty to confess to you. It is probable that Chris was the one to discover the secret vault in the wall there, whom Roy, without due reasoning, took to be Masters." "Was it Chris?" "Yes," Sax admitted. He was greatly disconcerted by his failure to add anything to the seer's knowledge. "Bully for Chris," David exclaimed. "Crafty old critter, too, to dig into that safe. Huh. I've heard about that sort of devotion on the part of old family servants, but it is the first instance I've struck in my own experience. Don't have 'em in Wyoming. Awful nuisance," Billy Walker grumbled. "Aged family retainers. Doddering remnants, always butting in." He gaped shamelessly, with a great noise. Sax, outraged by the sage's flippant reference to sacred things of his heart, felt himself indisposed for the further companionship of his friends just then. It was this mood, rather than any anxiety concerning the treasure, that led him to devise an excuse for separation. "Let's get to bed," he said, "and then make an early start for the island in the morning." Billy Walker, whose lids were weighted by the day's activities, grinned contentedly at the first phrase, and scowled portentously at the second. "That's the idea," David agreed. "We'll be off as soon as it gets to be light. I'll tell Jake to call us, and Mrs. Dustin to have our breakfast ready." He bustled out of the room, eager for the mission. Billy Walker groaned. "Dave is too precipitate," he growled. "Too precipitate by far." He rose and started for his room. If we're to arise at some ghastly hour, he explained to Sax, "I mustn't lose an instant in getting to bed. Brain workers require 10 hours of sleep. It's different with you others." His feelings somewhat soothed by this jibe, he departed. In consequence of David's alertness, they were routed out of bed the following morning while yet there was only the most pallid hint of gray in the east to foretell the dawn. When Billy Walker found that he required a lamp to direct the process of his toilet, he was in a state of revolt. He was thoroughly the blankets, and held it out for the others to see. "It's quite cold," he added. "It hasn't been lighted for some time." The others stared in silence for a little. Even yet, they were far from suspecting any evil. It was Jake who spoke at last. "I opine, he must have gone outside Summers, to kind o' stretch himself like. Got too sleepy, maybe." But now, David shook his head decisively. "No," he declared. "Roy's ears are mighty sharp, and we talked loudly enough in the launch to be heard a mile, specially Billy. If Roy had been anywhere on the island, top of the ground, he'd have heard us then, and have come running." David's expression changed to one of perplexity, in which alarm mingled. There was a new note of anxiety in his voice as he concluded. "And, if he was anywhere about this place, he'd have heard us, too, and have come running. And the lantern here." David's big eyes, shining weirdly through the lenses, went from one to another of the three men before him, as if seeking help against the trouble growing within him. "There's some mystery here," Sax exclaimed. Anxiety sounded in his voice. "We must search the cavern at once, for him. We already know he's not in this room. We'll look through the 2 passages that run down under the lake. Come on, Jake. You and I'll take the one on the right." He called over his shoulder to his friends, as he hurried forward. "You two take the passage on the left. If you find him, try to make us hear." It was David who found Roy, for impatience sent him far in advance of plotting Billy Walker. By the light of the lantern, David made out the huddled form lying on the floor of the passage, just at the turning. He ran forward with a cry of grief, and knelt beside the body. It had come to him in a flash that the event was more serious than anything he had apprehended. Masters had at last gained a victim. With the lantern set on the floor close at hand, David raised the body, which had been lying face downward. As he did so, he perceived the creased brow, with its matting of blood, now dried to a ruddy black. For an instant, David was stricken with a great fear lest his friend be dead. But, as he rested the head against him, a soft moan breathed from the lips, and at the sound hope sprang alive. He sent forth a shout, and Billy Walker, who was near, came running, for the first time in many years. No sooner had he learned of the injury to Roy than he set himself to summoning the others, and the vast voice rang thunderous through the subterranean ways. The mighty volume went rolling in sonorous waves throughout this secret place of the earth, penetrating every cranny and devious winding nook. Sax and Jake felt the smiting of it on their eardrums, and came racing through the break and into the passage whence the roaring issued. Even the unconscious man was not impervious to the gigantic din. He groaned, and his eyelids unclosed. David raised a hand for silence, and Billy Walker halted abruptly in his vociferation, his mouth wide. But, for a long time, the echoes clanged helter-skelter. When Sax and Jake came, they with David lifted the sufferer, and bore him along the passage, while Billy went before, bearing the 4 lanterns. In this manner, they were able to make rapid progress, and soon Roy was placed comfortably on the turf of the ravine, just outside the cavern entrance, with a coat to pillow his head. David brought water in one of the vessels from the hamper in the launch. Billy Walker, however, bethought himself of a flask which he had, and a little sup of the spirits was got into the wounded man's mouth. The effect of the stimulant was apparent almost at once. "Here it is." As the others came up to him, he pointed to where, a few feet in front, a break yawned in the flooring of the tunnel. Immediately, all were grouped about the edge of the opening, staring down into it with intense excitement. By this time, they had come to respect the resourcefulness of the engineer and his ability. The fact that the spot had held him absorbed appeared to them of high significance. Since the man had searched here before their coming, was it not probable that he had found the gold in this very place? The opening was perhaps 8 feet in length, by half as many in width. The depth was irregular. On the south end, it was hardly more than a foot below the level of the floor, running thus for a yard. Then, it sloped sharply and unevenly until it was a full 2 yards in depth at the wall of the tunnel, on the side nearer the other passage. The light of the lanterns shone on a litter of earth and fragments of stone. There was no sign of either chest or bags that might contain treasure. The 4 stared down in silence for a long minute. "We must dig here," David said, eagerly. "The money must be buried here." Jake leapt down into the pit, and inspected the confused mass of fragments, while the others looked on curiously. Presently, he raised his head, and spoke. "I calculate we're a mite behindhand, as it were. This hole's been dug all over mighty careful, and mighty lately, too." Chapter 22 The other passage. David voiced the general consternation. "By the Lord, Masters has got the gold, after all." The following silence admitted the truth of his lament. Sax's face set grimly. His tones came harsh, when at last he spoke. "We'll keep on hunting," he said. "Only, now we'll hunt Masters." Jake stood disconsolate, scratching his head, and staring wistfully from one to another. It was evident that he accepted the catastrophe as irremediable. Not so Billy Walker. On the contrary, Sax had hardly done speaking when the voice of the wise man came booming the decrees of ratiocination, with the usual pedantic note of authority. "The trouble with the disorderly mind is," he began, with didacticism almost insulting, "that it jumps to a conclusion without due consideration of all the facts. Suddenly confronted with one fact, which is admitted, the illogical person reaches a judgment without any scrutiny whatsoever of other vital facts concerned. Thus, in the instance before us." He paused, and his little dull eyes, twinkling now from excitement, went from one to another of the 3 men before him, who listened too anxiously to be in the least offended, for his opening gave them hope. They knew by experience that Billy's reasoning, notwithstanding all his boasts, was, indeed, usually exact, proven just by circumstance. The respectful attention on their faces was grateful to the seer. As he continued, his manner was more genial, though no less breathing the ipse dixit. "Jake has discovered that someone has been before us here, digging in this hole. That is one single, solitary fact. Instantly, all of you impulsively take it for granted that Masters has found the gold here, and has already removed it. As a matter of reason, the chances are greatly against this unwarrantable assumption. It is only necessary to consider all the facts in our possession to understand this. In the first place, the fact that this hole has been dug up recently does not prove that there was gold hidden in it. As far as our knowledge goes, the treasure may have been there, or it may not. There is not a particle of evidence one way or the other. Masters was after the gold. He hunted here. That's all we know. We do not know whether or not he found the money here. Even you chaps must admit that much." He regarded the trio with accusing glances, before which they nodded a meek assent. "Go on, Billy," Sax urged. "The undisguised character limit is exceeded." Not much time was required to make evident the fact that there could be nothing of value concealed in the pit. The litter was readily penetrated, and revealed beneath its solid rock, undisturbed since first set there by the processes of primeval ages. The discovery was a source of relief, rather than of disappointment, and Sax, doubtless encouraged by the tribute accorded to his reasoning powers by Billy Walker, called attention to the fact that the amount of loose matter in the pit was far from being sufficient to have concealed any great bulk of gold. It was, therefore, reasonable to suppose that the treasure had never been buried in this place. The seer gave a grunt of approbation. You advance by leaps and bounds, he declared. Exploration of the continuance of the passage was speedily effected, as it narrowed immediately beyond the pit, and came to a definite end within 10 yards. Thereupon, the four retraced their steps, inspecting with care every inch of the way, until they reached the break that formed a communication between the two tunnels. It was decided now that the party should divide, Billy and David keeping on in this passage, while Sax and the boatman crossed into the other, there to follow its length under the lake. Sax knew that he and the girl had gone a little way beyond the junction of the passages, and he was intensely eager to learn what might lie farther on. Hope mounted high as he set forth down the slope, with Jake hard at his heels. He realized that, for ill or weal, he was close to the issue of his adventure, and he dared expect success. The way at first led downward steeply, but afterward, at a point which, as Sax judged, was still well within the island, the tunnel ascended for a time, then ran level. This level broadened presently into a chamber, larger even than that back. At the entrance to the cavern, their lanterns showed a room fully 100 feet in diameter, irregular, its walls broken by many ledges, with here and there deep shadows that might shroud the entrances to other passages. It's not the place, though, Sax declared, for we are too high. This isn't under the lake, and the cipher says, the bed of the lake. Come on, Jake. He led the way toward a tunnel that yawned blackly on the south side of the chamber. This sloped sharply downward, without a bend. Sax, who possessed an instinct for location that was rarely at fault, had kept careful watch of every change in direction throughout the exploration. Jake, he said abruptly, after the straight course had been followed for a few rods, if we keep on like this, we ought to hit the passage where the pit is. I guess not, the boatman objected. We've been all over that thar tunnel, and there ain't no place where this here tunnel comes into it. Now, what do ye say to that, Mr. Temple, E.H.? Not a blessed thing, Sax replied. You're right, of course, and yet. Anyhow, I'd be willing to wager we'll run within a rod of the other passage, at farthest. Ain't no way of settlin' that thar day you're in, Jake commented, with a cackle. Guess as how I don't pine to bet none. The two went on in silence after this, moving at a fair rate of speed, for the tunnel was only slightly encumbered with debris, but they did not permit haste to breed neglect of their purpose. Ever, as they went, they kept a careful lookout for aught that might by any possibility be a hiding place for the miser's gold. On either side, they looked, above, below, always in vain. Nowhere in the descent was there anything to suggest a receptacle for stores of precious metal. Suddenly, Sax, who from his place in advance had been peering before him anxiously, spoke in a voice of discouragement. Jake, I believe we're coming to the end of it. The boatman quick, don't you go worrying yourself none over that, he counseled. That thar old man was a wonder in some ways. He was mighty powerful in his arms and chist. I seen him onset lift a barrel o' vinegar up by the chines into a wagon. I reckon he acquired considerable muscle from the pianner. He used to wallop it some tremendous, I tell you. Yep, he could heast out a heftier rock nor you or me. This information quickened Sax's hope, and he toiled on with increased energy. The boatman showed an equal zeal. The pit grew deeper momently. Suddenly, Jake gave forth a great shout. Jumpin', Jehoshaphat, we've struck it. He straightened up, his face creased with innumerable wrinkles of happiness as he looked across the pit at Sax. The heir of Abernethy was beside the speaker within the second. As he bent forward, following the boatman's gesture, he saw, in the open place left by the removal of the stone, a surface of oak. He understood that this must be the cover of a chest. An exclamation of triumph broke from his lips. He made no effort to conceal his agitation. Quick, quick, he cried. Let's get the other stones off. He hurled from the pit with ease one which, a minute before, he could hardly have stirred. The splendid madness of success tripled strength. The old man beside him shared in the frenzy of toil. Within an incredibly short time, the oak covering was laid bare, and one corner of the chest stood exposed for its whole height. It was a great box of polished wood, brass bound at the corners. The cover was made fast by hasp and padlock, the whole simple, yet very strong and handsome. "Hurrah!" Jake cried, as he paused from the work to wipe his dripping forehead. "Hurrah!" Sachs answered, as he, too, rested. Then, he remained staring at the mighty box, wherein lay a fortune. He was too dazed by the final victory to think with coherence. He could but feel, with every atom of the energy in him. There was no further interchange between the two for some time. In silence, they again attacked the litter of rock that surrounded the chest. It was freed at last from the rampart that had shielded it. Jake put his shoulder against the side, and essayed an experimental push. With a groan from the strain, he abandoned the futile effort. There was vast contentment in his smile when he spoke. "I calculate that thar box will heft pretty considerable. It's gold, all right." "Yes, it is the gold," Sachs agreed, dreamily. He was thinking of Margaret now, and he smiled as he reflected on the fact that the miser's legacy would fall to her and him together. A great longing to be alone assailed him. He turned impulsively to the boatman. "Hurry, and find the others, Jake," he directed. "You bet ye," the boatman responded, with alacrity. He was eager to bear the tidings. In a trice, he had scrambled out of the pit, seized his lantern, and set off briskly up the slope of the tunnel. Left alone, Sachs lighted a cigarette, smiling a little as he noted the manner in which his hands were trembling. Then, he seated himself comfortably at the edge of the pit, and gazed raptly down on the treasure chest. Chapter 23 The Blast. Roy, after an hour of basking on the turf in the mellow warmth of the sunshine, felt himself his own man again, in spite of the dull pain in his head. Curiosity spurred him to action. He stretched himself luxuriously, then stood up, bent his right arm until the biceps was iron hard, to prove that the strength was still in him. Thereafter, he made his way into the cavern. When he had come into the big room, he found his lantern by the aid of matches, lighted it, and then paused, listening, uncertain as to which of the two passages he should follow. He could hear nothing, and presently decided on the left one, in which he had met his discomfiture. He traversed this until he reached the rift that gave communication with the adjacent character limit as exceeded. On one of the fragments cast up from the pit, and prepared to offer such comments on future events as should suggest themselves to an orderly and logical mind. Jake proposed breaking open the lock, and then loading themselves with as much gold as they could carry, for transportation to the launch. Roy refused acceptance of this simple method. "It must weigh about 1,000 pounds, he said. "It's too heavy for us to carry all the way to the shore alone. Bring that heaviest cable from the launch, Jake, and the pulley tackle that's in the locker. Do that first. Perhaps Dave and I may be able to rig the pulley, and haul the chest up into the room above. Then, after you've brought the rope, go in the launch, and get half a dozen men from the landing, to help. Bring along, too, 4 heavy poles. We'll lash those on, to serve as handles in carrying the chest to the launch. Arrange for a lumber wagon at the landing. Miss Thurston told me there's a bank at the nearest town. Hadley. About 3 miles from the landing. E.H. Jake nodded assent. The day's young yet, Roy concluded. We'll land Abernethy's gold in the bank before night. Bank shuts up at 3 o'clock, the boatman objected. It'll open again fast enough for what's in this box, Roy retorted. You hurry up that cable, Jake. I'll go with him, David said. It may need more than the cable length for the business, it is quite a stretch up that slope. Roy nodded assent, and the two hastened off. During their absence, Roy, with the assistance of Sachs, busied himself in arranging a smooth plane of stones in that end of the pit nearer the ascent, in such fashion as to afford an easy slide for the chest. Soon, the cable was brought, and, while the others devoted themselves to the adjustment of this, Jake departed on his mission to the landing. The workers in the tunnel found themselves confronted with serious difficulty when it came to passing the rope underneath the chest. It required the joint efforts of the four, though Billy Walker's aid was not contributed without expostulation against the uselessness of this part of the labor. In the end, however, what by great exertion on the part of each and by the employment of the pickaxes as levers and bits of rock as supports, the task was achieved, and the rope was got in position under the chest. The remainder of the business was simple enough. In a short time, the box was firmly set within the hempen bands, knotted with seaman-like smartness by Roy, and the main length of the cable was free for adjustment to block and tackle. The extent of it, to Roy's relief, proved ample for the purpose, and forthwith he and David carried the free end of it up the slope to the level of the chamber, in quest of some projection of rock to which the hook of the block might be made fast. Sax and Billy remained below, beside the treasure chest. Sax lighted another cigarette, Billy had recourse to one of his customary black cigars, and the two smoked contentedly in silence. Sax could hear indistinctly from time to time the movements of Roy and David, busy on the level above. And then, presently, his ears detected another sound. He listened. Idly at first, soon with growing interest, finally with intent curiosity, which swiftly became excitement. The noise was faint, intermittent, yet persistent. In his earlier attention to it, Sax found difficulty in locating the direction whence the sound issued, but, later on, he became sure that it had its origin somewhere in the other passage, beyond the barrier that divided the pit into two parts. The fact filled him with amazement. He knew the whereabouts of all in his own party. He could still hear Roy and David, active on the level above. Billy Walker was there present with him by the pit. Jake, ere this, was on his way to the landing in the launch. It was to his friends. In the next moment, the light of his lantern revealed Billy Walker, running at a good pace just before him. "Masters has let in the lake," Sax cried frantically in his friend's ear, as he came abreast. There was no need of the telling. Even as he spoke, the first waves lashed their feet. No time was given them to mend their speed. Before they could do more than realize the coming of the flood, it had reached to their waists, to their armpits. They had dropped the drenched lanterns. They were swimming blindly on the rushing torrent. But Billy, whose bulk kept him afloat easily, had put out a hand, so that he held fast to Sax's collar. Thus, they were borne onward together through the fearful blackness, tossed and torn by the coil of waters. That contact of each with the other was their single comfort. Of a sudden, they felt themselves twisted violently to one side. Then, for once, the majestic volume of Billy Walker's voice served his necessity. The words bellowed in Sax's ear came softly, as from an infinite distance, yet clearly. "There's no turn like that. We're in the chamber. Make to the left, to the ledges, for your life. It's our only chance." By mercy of fate, the eddy helped them on their course. But for that, they could never have won through against the mighty urge of the current. The eddy sent them far to the left, and they fought on with all their strength, when the pull of it would have swung them back toward the vortex. Then as he felt that he could strive no more, Sax felt his fingers touch on stone. While his hand rasped on the rock for hold, his feet found footing. In the next moment, he realized as never before the great strength of his companion. A violent thrust upward fairly shot him clear of the water. Before he had time to help himself, Billy was again at his side, was dragging him still higher on the tumble of rocks. "To the top," boomed the sage. "It may be high enough, and it may not. Anyhow, it is the only chance." And, presently, the two were on the summit of the pile of stone. Below them, the writhing waters clamored in rage. But the flood did not reach to them. Each second, Sax expected to feel the swirl of it about his feet, leaping to engulf him. He was shuddering from dread of it. The quick horror of the event bred cowardice. Then, yet once again, he heard the huge voice of his friend. "We're safe. Safe." But Sax could not believe him. "How do you know?" he shouted. The sage had not heard the feebler tones through the din, but he guessed the question. "The water just reaches my foot. It has mounted no higher through a full minute. But it may yet." This time, Billy heard. "Use your reason, the water at my foot marks the level of the lake. It can rise no higher. Cheer up, my boy." Chapter 24 Entombed. For a little, after he had realized the fact that the water could mount no higher, Sax experienced such joy as must come to any normal person on escaping out of the peril of death. Ultimately, however, the first emotion wore itself out by its own intensity, and he was left free to think coherently again. The result was disastrous. There leapt in his consciousness the hideous truth that death was not avoided, only postponed. This refuge on the heap of rocks offered safety from drowning, from being crushed by the waves against the walls. It gave no more. On this tiny island, the two were marooned, with naught to expect save a slow, a frightful death. They had been borne hither on the first inrush of the waters, and only the height of the cavern had saved them at that time. Now, there was no means by which they might make their way out from this prison. Beyond the chamber in which they were, the passage that led to the outdoors first dipped sharply. For a great way it must be filled with the flood. Margaret West had spoken of another entrance somewhere, but she had character limit as exceeded. Roy lamented in characteristic fashion, after Sax and Billy had explained the cause of the lake's inflow, which had been a mystery to the other two. "I'm sorry I couldn't have had a chance at Masters before he went." David's voice, usually so kindly, was harsh as he spoke. "The skunk got us, after all," he mourned. He added, with frank ferocity. Damn him. He knew, as did the others, that such speech concerning the dead was unseemly. Yet none rebuked him. For a moment, the warmth of wrath was comfort against the chill desolation of their case. Nevertheless, Billy Walker's ruling passion was so strong that not even death might daunt it. The action of Masters required some explanation, to make all clear before the less orderly minds of his friends. So, after a period of reflection, he expounded his understanding of the engineer's part in the final act of their drama. The volume of his voice was such that he did not need to go beyond his usual conversational thundering to be heard distinctly by those on the opposite side of the chamber. Masters, naturally, didn't mean to do this thing, he declared. He wasn't the type to commit suicide. He kept track of us all the time. How he did it doesn't matter especially. Probably, he used another entrance to the cavern, which we don't know. Anyhow, he learned what it was we had found down this way. I guess he spied on us, and heard you, Roy, and Dave, working on the tackle, and took it for granted we were all here together. He thought he could burrow through, and get at the gold himself while we were off after help. He meant to blow an opening just big enough to get through, I fancy. He failed to take into consideration the frailness of the roof that stood between the passage and the lake. He blew a hole in the bottom of the lake, and that was the beginning of our troubles, and the ending of his. He couldn't find a refuge like ours in that other passage. Exit Masters. I regret our fate, but not his. With this succinct statement, the sage relapsed into silence, which continued until Roy relieved his overwrought feelings by a denunciation against fate. I've been on the edge of dying many a time, he declared, bitterly, but I was never up against this sort of thing before, and I'm free to say that I don't like it. There's some satisfaction in being done to death in a good fight, or in battling your best against any kind of odds. Of course, a man doesn't exactly want to die, any time. But what puts me in the dumps is this particular variety of dying that we're up against here. We've got to sit roosting on a shelf in the dark, like a heathen idol in a temple after it has been buried in an earthquake, and we've just got to sit till we starve to death. I do hope I run across Masters in the next world. Let us hope for your own sake that both you and Dave do not have your wishes granted concerning masters in the next world, Billy exclaimed. The grim jest was not amusing in their situation. The three hearers shivered a little, and were silent. Afterward, the four gave themselves to serious meditation, as is fitting to men in the presence of death. On one occasion, Billy, in answer to a question from David, discoursed freely on the reasonableness of belief in a future life, and pleaded in defense of such faith with a lucid sincerity and completeness that first surprised, then comforted his audience. Each, after his own fashion, believed in the continuance of life through death. Nonetheless, each was loath to put off the garment of mortality. Billy Walker would fain have remained on earth for a larger accumulation of its wisdom, with which, as it seemed to him, he had only just begun. Before Roy could voice the protest on his lips, a cry came from Sax. "Hark! Hark!" The others held silent, marveling what this might mean. To their ears came the gentle lapping of the waves against the walls of the prison house, the faint sighs of their own breathing, nothing else. After a long time, Sax spoke again, and his voice was lifeless, where before it had been vibrant with feeling. "I must be going mad," he said, simply. "I thought that I heard someone calling my name." Chapter 25. To the chimney. As they were lingering over the breakfast table, that same morning, Margaret turned to May with a smile. "And to think of them, off adventuring now, this very minute," she exclaimed, pouting a little. "It was rather horrid of them to go at such an unearthly hour, when of course we weren't up." May nodded cheerfully. "Yes, I'd have enjoyed being in at the finish, if only I'd been invited." "And I, too," Margaret declared. "Anyhow, it is my affair in a way, so I think I'm entitled to a spectator's privilege, at least." "It must be horribly exciting for you, with so much money involved," May ventured, somewhat timidly. Margaret received the suggestion without sign of offense, and answered seriously. "I don't wish Mr. Temple to fail. I don't really need the money. Besides," she broke off in confusion. "And, besides, everything may come out right, after all, for everybody concerned," May said slyly. Margaret blushed to warmest rose, but she showed no displeasure at the innuendo. "Except the poor musicians," she remarked, and then the two girls laughed joyously. As a matter of fact, each of them understood perfectly the progress of the other's love affair, but their intimacy was too new for the most sacred confidences. Then, Margaret received an inspiration. "Why, we'll go," she exclaimed. Her expression showed surprised triumph over the idea. "Where?" May questioned, at a loss. "To the island, of course," came the brisk answer. "I'll run and tell Mother, and then we'll paddle up there, and see everything that's to be seen." "Splendid!" May cried with enthusiasm. She was interested in the outcome of the treasure hunt, but at this moment her sole thought was a thrilling one to the effect that by the plan she would see Roy the sooner. So, it came about that in mid-afternoon the two girls beached the canoe on the strip of sand at the island, and started toward the cavern. They were a little puzzled by the absence of the launch, and wondered if the fact were significant of good or ill fortune for the searchers. As they came to the top of the low bluff that rose from the shore, Margaret paused, and turned to look out over the lake. "No, the launch isn't in sight anywhere," she said. As she would have faced about to go on, a faint muffled sound came to her ears. The ground trembled very slightly, a movement of the lake's surface caught her glance. A moment before, the tiny waves, glistening prisms under the sunlight, had made a scene of quiet beauty. Now, in the twinkling of an eye, there had come a change curious, inexplicable, sinister. Out there in the lake, only a little way from the shore, the water, which had been so placid when they skimmed over it hardly a minute before, was now writhing in a horrible convulsion. Yet, no unwarned tempest racked the lake. The warm air was floating as languidly as hitherto. Nothing had been hurled into the water. There had been no crash of fallen meteor. not showed as the cause of this amazing contrast. Nevertheless, under her eyes, the erstwhile tranquil bosom of the lake heaved in rage. 50 yards from the shore, the water raced, lashing itself in wrath about the sunken center of its vortex. Margaret, thrilled, astounded, terrified, they were garrulous over the mystery, hardly concerned with the treasure quest, for the moment. But the new interest had not lessened the desire of their hearts, and they quickened their steps, each at thought of the man she loved, now so near at hand. So they came soon to the cliff in the ravine, where was the entrance to the cave. Margaret had brought her torch, which Jake had recharged for her the night before from his own supplies. She pressed the button, pushed aside the concealing branches, and made her way within the opening, followed closely by May, who experienced a pleasurable excitement as she thus penetrated into the earth. The two came duly to the chamber, which they crossed to where the black openings into the tunnels showed. Now, May's heart beat faster, as she found herself deep in this grim abode of darkness, where the limited radiance of the torch served but to make more grotesquely menacing the shadowy unknown on every side. Yet, she would not confess the fear that clutched at her, only held fast to Margaret's arm, and chatted with unusual volubility, while a little quaver crept in her voice. They entered the passage on the right, which Margaret had traversed with sacks, and went forward with what speed they might over the rocks that cumbered the floor. They had descended for some distance, but had not yet reached the rift that led across into the other tunnel, when Margaret halted abruptly, with a gasp of amazement. It is water," she cried, dumbfounded. She stood staring with dilated eyes, her lips parted, stupefied with astonishment, pointing with her free hand to the space before her, where the glow of the torch shone on a softly rippling level of water, which filled the tunnel like the contents of a well seen down the slope. May, who had held her eyes fixed on the floor to save herself from stumbling, looked forward at the exclamation, and perceived the water. But the sight was not especially impressive to her. She supposed that here was merely a well in the path. She did not understand her friend's dismay. "What is it?" she asked, with no great interest. She wondered in which direction they would turn to pass by the pool. Margaret, however, was thinking with desperate energy. Her mind was naturally keen, and it had enjoyed advantages of careful training. She began, at last, to suspect something as to the true significance of the catastrophe in the lake, which hitherto had baffled comprehension. The presence of water in the cavern, where before had been no water, stunned her at first. Then, as she apprehended vaguely the meaning of it, it appalled. There where the tunnel was steep, the water filled it completely. She went forward until the water was at her very feet, and stared down at it, her face colorless, her pulse bounding wildly, in the grip of cold horror. Finally, she began stammering affrightedly. "The lake! The water out there! It is broken into the cavern, they're drowned! Drowned! Sacks!" Her voice rose to a wail on the last word. Margaret's terror, rather than her words, had filled the other girl with dismay at the first. But drowned gave form to fear. May, in turn, was stricken with horror. "Drowned," she repeated, in a whisper. Roy. Her memory went back to the scene she had just witnessed on the lake. The utterance of Margaret, broken, uncomprehended, became hideously plain. It meant that the lake had somehow entered this cavern, which ran beneath the waters. In that case, the men down within the earth there must have been overwhelmed by the inpouring flood. But, even as conviction came, her spirit refused credence to the truth. She cried aloud in revolt. "No, no, no, I tell you. They are safe, safe." Margaret gave no heed to the folly of the words. The confidence in them spurred her to endeavor. "Shall I go, too?" she asked. Margaret shook her head. She turned to scan the lake. "No," she said. "You couldn't help. And it may be bad climbing. But I'm used to that. You keep watch for Jake in the launch. He may be needed later on." With that as the last word, she let herself down into the chimney of the rocks. May from above gazed with wide eyes until the form of her friend disappeared into the blackness below. Then, she turned to look out over the lake, in anxious search for the coming of the launch. Standing alone there, with the dreadful mystery hidden within the earth under her feet, she felt a quick reaction of doubt, which welled swiftly to the torture of despair. The strength flowed from her. She sank to her knees, and stared down into the dark of the chasm with dull, unseeing eyes, rested motionless in the apathy of supreme misery. Chapter 26. In the dark. Margaret, as she let herself down into the chimney, held the torch so as to show her surroundings. She still clung to the rock above with her right hand, while the left was occupied by the torch. As yet, she had found no footing. The light revealed that this opening through the ridge was the result of the lodging of one huge block of stone, which had left the angle between it and the other rock empty. A clutter of fragments formed the third side of a triangle, which extended downward steeply as far as she could see. A feeling of sick apprehension swept over her when she perceived the manner in which some of the stones hung, seemingly poised to a fall. Then, in the next instant, she recalled the reason of her presence there, and conquered dread in the need of action. She saw a jutting bit of rock a few inches below her feet. She let herself down to the extreme limit of reach, and found herself just able to touch the support with a toe. She released her hand hold, and thus remained, half standing, half lying in the hole. She searched out other points to which her fingers might cling, at the height of her breast. Clenching these, she bent her knees, and finally came to a crouching posture on the tiny ledge that had been under her feet. In the like tedious, slow fashion, she continued the descent, for a distance of perhaps 20 feet, without mishap, though in constant danger of a fall. But, at this point, new difficulties threatened. Though she took long to search, she could find nothing to afford a foothold, even the tiniest. To make the matter worse, just here the smoothness of the walls was such that her hands could secure only a doubtful grip. She studied the situation painstakingly by means of the torch, making sure that nowhere a projection of the stone escaped her observation. She was distraught by this ill fortune, which threatened the ruin of her hopes. Finally, however, she perceived by the light of the torch that, 2 yards or more below the point to which her feet reached, the chimney bent a little, toward the horizontal. At the sight, Margaret's courage sprang to new life. Without a second of delay in which fear might grow, she loosed her hold, and let herself slip downward. The steepness of the chimney was so great that her movement was rather a fall than a slide. In the very second of the start, she felt the violent impact of her feet against the stone as they struck the bend. Nor was the change of direction sufficient to overcome the impetus of the drop, as she had hoped. Her body shot onward down the rough slope. She caught at the walls with her fingers, but, though the ragged surface tore the skin from her flesh, she could get no clutch strong enough to stay the flight. The torch had slipped from her grasp without her even being aware of its loss at the time. In the darkness, she went hurtling on. Her spirit broke in those seconds of dreadfulness. She felt that death waited at the end of the fall. Saxe's name was on her lips when she crashed into pause. For a long character limit is exceeded. You, Margaret, you came for us. Yes. There was no need to explain that she had come for him alone. Oh, she would be very glad that the others should win to life. But she had come for him only. You are safe, she added. Yes. The others were silent, giving the dialogue to the girl and Saxe, for they understood how it was between the two. You came by the other entrance, of which you told me. Yes. Through the chimney, on the ridge by the shore. May is there, watching and waiting for Jake to come. We shall need help to get out. It is hard to climb. I slipped coming down. You are hurt. The lover's voice was harsh with fear. But Margaret laughed blithely. What matter a few bruises now? It shook me up a bit, she confessed. But I'm all right. The worst of it was that I lost my torch. Can you come to me here? I know how to find the way back in the dark. Billy Walker deemed it time that he should assume direction of the affair. Do you know how high above the water you are there, Miss West? He demanded. The gruff voice was very gentle, for gratitude to this girl burned hot in him, as in the others. She had brought the gift of life to dead men. No, Margaret answered. You are on a ledge, of course, the sage continued. Please get to the edge of it, and reach down with your hand, and find if you can touch the water. There was a little delay before the reply came. Yes. Be careful. The sharp admonition was from Sax. It's almost level with the shelf I'm on, the girl continued. Good. Billy's tone was full of satisfaction. That makes it very simple. We shall swim across to you, and then you will guide us from these Plutonian shades back to the upper world. He turned toward the companions whom he could not see, and addressed them with crisp authority. You will go first, Sax. Her voice will guide you. She's directly across the chamber from us. Be ready afterward to help us with David when we get there. We shall allow you ample time to climb out before we start to tote Dave. Go ahead. I'm off, Sax answered, promptly. Then, he called to Margaret, talk a bit, please, while I'm in the water, so that I'll know the direction. I'm just starting. There was a slight splash as Sax lowered his body into the water, and the soft swish from his strokes as he swam away. Here, Sax. Here I am. This way. The girl continued the calls with joy in her tones. Then, a minute later, she heard him speak her name softly, at her feet. In another instant, he was beside her on the ledge. She was in his arms, their lips met. He had no thought of his dripping garments, nor had she. They had no knowledge of anything save heaven. Billy Walker's voice went thundering across the cavern. Are you there, Sax? There was no reply. The sage chuckled aloud. The exercise of reason teaches me, he explained in a voluminous whisper, that our dear young friend is not drowned. Oh, no. As a matter of fact, at this moment, he has already got clear of the water, and doesn't know where he is, but is happier than he ever was before in his life. When he awakes from the trance, he will address us. So, in truth, it came to pass. Presently, the call came from Sax, and the progress of the three across the cavern was safely accomplished. Arrived, they pressed about the girl, who was standing, supported by her lover's arm, and mightily embarrassed by the fervor of their gratitude for the boon of life bestowed on them by her intrepidity and resource. Finally, the five set forth along the ledge, following it as Margaret had come, by groping on the sheer wall from which it jutted. And, now, the girl no longer went with painful slowness on hands and knees, but walked bravely, upheld by the lover at her side. So, at last, they came to the spot where Margaret's fall had ended. To their left, seemingly character limit is exceeded. On the part of the lovers in looking out for the coming of the launch, was due the quickness with which measures of relief were undertaken for those left in the depths. Ropes were hurried to the scene. A lantern was lowered. It was then discovered that the descent was not so very difficult. With the way lighted, and a rope by which to cling, the various members of the party contrived to climb safely to the mouth of the chimney. Margaret went first, with Sax behind to aid as best he might. David Thwing was next, and last of all, by his own choice, Billy Walker. If I go last, he explained to David, I'm saved the discomfort of feeling that I ought to be hurrying to get out of somebody's way. After the rescue had been effected, a watch made up from men trusted by the boatman was set over the chimney, at Roy's suggestion. Then, the four young men, with the two girls, entered the launch to be taken to the cottage, for a change of clothing and luncheon. Billy chuckled contentedly, while the other men appeared sheepish, when it was learned that noon remained still an hour distant. But the chances are poor of ever getting that gold, after all, Sax said ruefully, when they were under way. Roy uttered an indignant exclamation. Nothing of the sort, he declared. David and I had the tackle fastened, all right, with a knot on the rope to save it from slipping through the block. And we had it hauled tight, too. He laughed amusedly. Why, do you know? That treasure chest has started up the slope already. I'll bet what you like the shrinking of the rope has brought it out of the pit. A good gang of men can get that chest out in less than a half day. He spoke with the sureness of one having knowledge drawn from experience. That he was right the issue proved, for the gold was taken out very easily, and stored safely in the bank before nightfall. That evening in the music room, Sax sat playing the miser's song of gold. Still drumming the harsh phrases, he turned, and spoke to his friends with a whimsical smile. You know, I rather apologized to you for asking your help in this affair, because it didn't offer anything much in the way of real adventure, but it did turn out a bit lively after all. Came a chorus of laughing assents. We owe Masters gratitude for some thrills, David said cheerfully. And anyhow, he's got his deserts. Roy was on the point of saying something candid anent the dead engineer. But his eyes met those of May Thurston, and he forgot hate, and remembered only love. Sax spoke again presently, with a meditative air, though Margaret thought that she could detect a twinkle deep in the gray eyes. Roy was right in his idea about the solution of the mystery coming by psychic impression. It did. The curious part is that the one to receive the subtle suggestion from the world beyond was the last person to be suspected of anything of the kind, a kind so contrary to pure reason. What's that? Billy Walker demanded. Why, about the cipher, Sax explained, placidly. Billy, tell us the truth. Search your memory well. Didn't you first have the idea that the music had something to do with the hiding place of the gold, and then didn't you dig out the reasons to justify that idea, after you had it? Of all the preposterous, the sage began stormily. But Sax interrupted ruthlessly. Carefully. Search your memory, Billy. Didn't the idea come first, the reasons afterward? Aren't you psychically sensitive, Billy Walker? Confess. Psychic. The seer boomed, outraged. Then, his brow became furrowed with thought. His expression changed to one of dismay. Little by little, this wore away, a dawning satisfaction grew in its stead. Finally, he spoke aloud to himself, unconsciously. Psychic. Well,